The desert wind carried the scent of blood and burning cedar across the New Mexico Badlands. In a territory where survival meant choosing sides, one Apache drifter had sworn never to choose at all, until the night gunfire shattered the silence at the Bennett Ranch. What began as a stranger as intervention would become a debt that couldn't be repaid with gold or gratitude, only with a promise neither was prepared to make. Before dawn broke over the high mesas, Catherine Bennett would learn that salvation sometimes arrives wearing war paint and carrying ghosts that refuse to stay buried. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The town of Mesa Ridge existed in that peculiar corner of New Mexico territory, where the desert meets the mountains, where Apache land bled into settler territory without clear boundaries or easy peace. It was 1887, and the world was changing faster than most folks could accept. The railroad had come through 5 years prior, bringing with it merchants, soldiers, and men who saw the vast empty spaces as opportunities rather than warnings. Daniel Running Wolf knew better than to linger in such places. He rode into the outskirts of Mesa Ridge just as the sun began its descent behind the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, painting the sky in shades of copper and crimson that reminded him too much of other sunsets, other endings. His paint horse, a sturdy mare he called Whisper for her silent footfalls, picked her way carefully along the dusty road that served as the town's southern approach. Daniel kept his hat pulled low, his eyes scanning the scattered buildings ahead with the practiced wariness of a man who'd learned that towns meant trouble. At 28, he carried himself with the coiled tension of someone perpetually ready to move, to fight, or to disappear. His Apache mother had taught him the old ways before fever took her when he was 12. His white father, a trapper named Joshua Running Wolf, who'd taken his wife's people's name as his own, had taught him to navigate both worlds before vanishing into the mountains one winter and never returning. Now Daniel belonged to neither world fully, which meant he belonged nowhere at all. The town itself was larger than he'd expected. A main street lined with false-fronted buildings, their fresh paint already fading under the relentless sun. A general store, a bank, a hotel with actual glass windows, 2 saloons competing for the same drunks, and at the far end, a white church whose steeple reached toward heaven like an accusation. Beyond the town, stretching in every direction, lay the ranches and farms that gave Mesa Ridge its reason to exist. Daniel had no intention of staying. He needed only supplies, coffee, ammunition, dried meat. Then he'd continue north into Colorado territory, where a man with his face and heritage might find work on the railroad or in the silver mines, places where questions weren't asked and the past stayed buried. He guided Whisper toward the general store, noting the stares that followed his progress down the street. A woman pulled her child closer as he passed. 2 men standing outside the bank stopped their conversation to watch him with narrowed eyes. An old-timer sitting in front of the hotel spat tobacco juice in his direction, missing by design, but making his sentiment clear. Daniel had long since stopped caring about such gestures. Hatred was as much a part of the landscape as sagebrush and rattlesnakes. The general store was dim and smelled of leather, tobacco, and the peculiar mustiness of goods shipped from distant cities. The proprietor, a thin man with spectacles perched on a prominent nose, looked up from his ledger with an expression that moved from curiosity to wariness in the space of a heartbeat. Daniel placed $3 silver on the counter. Coffee, ammunition for a Winchester rifle, and whatever dried meat you can spare. The proprietor's eyes flickered to the money, then to Daniel's face, lingering on the high cheekbones and dark skin that marked his heritage. We don't sell to Indians. I'm not asking for credit, Daniel replied evenly. Cash payment for goods, that's commerce, not charity. Don't matter, store policy. Daniel felt the familiar heat building in his chest, the anger he'd learned to bank like a fire that couldn't be allowed to rage. He'd encountered this particular brand of commerce before, in a dozen towns across 3 territories. Sometimes he argued, sometimes he simply left. Today, exhaustion made the choice for him. He collected his silver dollars without another word and turned toward the door. "There's a trading post 8 miles south," the proprietor called after him, "run by a half-breed named Martinez. He'll probably sell it to you." Daniel didn't acknowledge the suggestion. He stepped back into the fading daylight, squinting against the sun's horizontal glare. Whisper waited patiently at the hitching post, and he was about to mount when a commotion erupted from the saloon across the street. 3 men stumbled out, their movements exaggerated by whiskey and whatever grievances had begun inside. The largest of the 3, a bull-shouldered man with a beard that couldn't hide the meanness in his face, shoved one of his companions hard enough to send him sprawling in the dust. "I don't care what Bennett thinks he can do," the big man roared, his words slurred but understandable. "That land should have been open range, and his fences are strangling every small operation in the valley. Time someone taught that old bastard and his uppity daughter that they don't own this whole territory." Daniel recognized the type immediately. Small ranchers or cowboys, resentful of larger operations, drowning their failures in alcohol and blame. He'd seen it before, and it wasn't his concern. He placed his boot in the stirrup, preparing to mount. "Tonight," another man said, slightly less drunk than his companion, "Wade, maybe we should think this through. Bennett's got hired men, and that daughter of his can shoot better than most of us." "That's why we go tonight," Wade replied, steadying himself against the saloon's porch post. "Most of his crew went north with that cattle drive. It's just the old man, the girl, and maybe 2 ranch hands. We burn the fence lines, scatter his cattle, and maybe teach Miss Catherine that she can't testify against honest men trying to make a living." The 3rd man, younger than the others, looked uncertain. "Burning fences is one thing, Wade, but if you're talking about hurting a woman—" "I'm talking about sending a message," Wade cut him off. "About reminding folks that there's still justice for the common man, even if the law won't provide it." Daniel paused, his boot still in the stirrup. This wasn't his fight. The Bennetts, whoever they were settlers who'd claimed land that had once belonged to his mother's people. Their problems with other settlers were part of the same story that had displaced entire tribes. He owed them nothing. Yet something in the way Wade spoke about the woman, Catherine, stirred an old anger Daniel thought he'd buried. He'd seen what happened when men decided that sending a message to a woman was justified. He'd been 14 when raiders attacked a small Apache camp where he was staying with his mother's cousin. He'd hidden in the rocks as they had, watching helplessly as men in soldiers' uniforms did things that had nothing to do with war and everything to do with the cruelty that flourished when the civilized veneer wore thin. He removed his boot from the stirrup. Wade and his companions were mounting their horses now, their movements clumsy but determined. They rode east out of town, toward a dirt road that wound between rocky outcroppings and scattered juniper trees. Daniel waited until they'd disappeared from view, then swung onto Whisper and followed at a distance. The sun was fully down now, leaving only the purple afterglow that would soon surrender to darkness. Daniel relied on the sound of hoofbeats ahead to track his quarry, staying far enough back to avoid detection. He told himself he was merely curious, that he'd observe from a distance and then continue on his way. But he knew even then that he was lying to himself. The Bennett Ranch appeared as a constellation of lights in the gathering darkness. The main house was substantial, a 2-story structure built of adobe and timber, with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Outbuildings clustered nearby, a barn, a bunkhouse, corrals, and what looked like a smokehouse. Beyond the immediate compound, Daniel could make out the dark lines of fencing stretching into the distance, enclosing pastures where cattle would be bedded down for the night. Wade and his 2 companions had stopped on a ridge overlooking the ranch, their silhouettes visible against the last light in the western sky. Daniel dismounted and moved closer on foot, using the natural cover of rocks and scrub to conceal his approach. He settled behind a boulder about 30 yards from where the men sat their horses, close enough to hear their voices carried on the night breeze. "Lights in the main house and the bunkhouse," one of them observed. "Could be more people than we thought." "Doesn't matter," Wade replied. "We'll start with the fence lines on the south pasture. Once those are burning good, everyone will rush out to fight the fire. That's when we hit the barn. By the time they realize what's happening, we'll be gone, and Bennett will have lost enough to think twice about expanding his operation." "And if someone gets hurt?" the younger man asked. Wade's laugh was harsh. "Then they should have stayed inside where it's safe." Daniel watched as the three men urged their horses down the ridge toward the ranch's southern boundary. He should leave now, ride north, and let these settlers sort out their own feuds. But his feet carried him down the slope instead, following the path the riders had taken. His hand resting on the knife at his belt, the southern fence line stretched for what seemed like miles. Posts driven deep into the rocky soil, wire strung tight between them. Wade and his companions had dismounted and were splashing coal oil from tin cans onto the wooden posts and the dry grass growing along the fence. The smell of kerosene cut through the clean desert air. Daniel moved silently through the darkness, closing the distance. He was perhaps 20 feet away when Wade struck a match. The tiny flame flared bright in the blackness, and for a moment the man's face was illuminated, eager, vicious, pleased with his own daring. "Stop!" Daniel's voice cut through the night like a blade. All three men spun toward the sound. Wade's match went out. For a moment nobody moved. "Who the hell are you?" Wade demanded, his hand dropping to the revolver at his hip. "Someone suggesting you reconsider your plans." Daniel stepped into the open where they could see him, his hands held away from his weapons in a gesture that was neither threatening nor submissive. Wade squinted into the darkness, then laughed when he got a better look at Daniel. "An Indian? You're telling me what to do? Boy, you must have a death wish wandering around in the dark, interfering in white men's business." "This isn't business," Daniel replied calmly. "This is cowardice. 3 men against an old rancher and his daughter, burning property in the night. Where I come from, we had words for men like that, and none of them were compliments." Wade's face darkened with fury. "Where do you come from? You mean those camps full of savages who couldn't hold on to this land when civilized folk came to claim it? Don't talk to me about cowardice, you." His hand went for his gun. Daniel moved faster, covering the distance between them in 3 long strides. He caught Wade's gun hand at the wrist, twisting hard. The revolver discharged into the ground as Wade yelped in pain and surprise. Daniel's other hand came up, the butt of his knife connecting with the side of Wade's head, hard enough to drop him to his knees. The second man was drawing his weapon when Daniel spun and threw his knife in a single fluid motion. The blade embedded itself in the man's forearm, not deep, but painful enough to make him drop his gun with a scream. The third man, the youngest, raised his hands immediately. "I didn't want any part of this," he said quickly. "I told them it was wrong." "Then take your friends and leave," Daniel said, retrieving his knife and wiping the blade clean on Wade's shirt while the man groaned on the ground. "And tell anyone else who's thinking about coming here that the Bennett Ranch is under protection." "Protection from who?" the young man asked, helping the injured companion to his feet while Wade struggled to rise. "Who are you?" Daniel didn't answer. He simply stared at them until all 3 had mounted their horses and ridden back toward town, Wade clutching his head and swearing vengeance in words that faded into the distance. In the silence that followed their departure, Daniel became aware of another presence. He turned to find a woman standing 30 feet away, illuminated by the lamp she carried in one hand. In her other hand was a rifle, held with the easy competence of someone who knew how to use it. Catherine Bennett was not what he'd expected. Perhaps mid-20s, she wore men's work clothes, canvas pants, a plain shirt, leather vest, and her dark blonde hair was pulled back in a practical braid. But it was her face that caught his attention, strong-featured, sun-weathered, with eyes that assessed him with intelligence rather than fear. "That was quite a performance," she said. her voice carrying clearly across the space between them. Though I should mention I had Wade sighted and was about to solve this problem myself before you intervened. Daniel said nothing, suddenly uncertain. He'd acted on instinct, and now he was faced with the reality of his situation, a stranger on private property, having just assaulted 3 men, confronting an armed woman who had every right to shoot him and call it defense of her land. Catherine took a step closer, lifting the lamp higher to see him better. Her eyes widened slightly as she took in his features, the clear evidence of his heritage. But unlike the storekeeper or the townspeople, she didn't reach for her rifle. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You're Apache," she stated simply. "Half," Daniel replied. "My father was white, and you just happened to be passing by when 3 men decided to burn my fences. I heard them talking in town. Followed them out here." Catherine studied him for a long moment. "Why? We're strangers to you. This isn't your land or your fight." Daniel found he didn't have a good answer. "Why indeed? Because of a memory from 14 years ago? Because Wade's voice had awakened something in him that refused to stay quiet? Because he was tired of riding past injustice simply because it didn't directly concern him?" "I don't know," he finally admitted. "Maybe I should have kept riding." "Maybe," Catherine agreed. Then, unexpectedly, she lowered her rifle and held out her hand. "Catherine Bennett. Apparently I'm in your debt, mister." "Daniel Running Wolf." He took her hand, surprised by the firm grip. "Well, Daniel Running Wolf, you just made some dangerous enemies. Wade Garrison and his friends aren't the type to forget being humiliated." She glanced toward the fence line, where the coal oil still gleamed wetly on the posts. "We should clean this up before someone else gets ideas." "We?" Daniel questioned. Catherine smiled, and it transformed her serious face into something unexpectedly warm. "You saved my property and possibly my life. The least I can do is help you finish the job. Besides, my father is going to want to meet the man who single-handedly ran off 3 armed arsonists." Before Daniel could protest, she was already moving toward the fence line, setting down her lamp and rifle. "There's a shovel in the barn. We'll need to dig out the soil where the oil soaked in and cover it with fresh dirt. Shouldn't take more than an hour if we both work." Daniel found himself following her, drawn by her matter-of-fact competence and the strange feeling that his life had just veered onto a path he'd never planned to take. As he walked beside Catherine Bennett toward the barn, the New Mexico night vast and star-filled above them, he couldn't shake the sensation that some decisions, once made, couldn't be unmade. The wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain. Whisper nickered softly from where he'd left her on the ridge. And Daniel Running Wolf, who'd sworn never to let anyone's troubles become his own, realized he'd just claimed responsibility for a debt that hadn't even been calculated yet. Tomorrow would bring consequences. Tonight there was only the work, the woman beside him, and the peculiar sense that running away was no longer an option. The Bennett ranch house smelled of coffee, wood smoke and leather when Daniel stepped through the door an hour later. Catherine had insisted he come inside after they'd finished burying the oil-soaked earth, and though every instinct told him to decline and ride away into the darkness, something kept him rooted in place. The interior was surprisingly refined for a working ranch. Navajo rugs covered the plank floors, their geometric patterns speaking to trades with the tribes that still moved through the territory. Books lined shelves built into one wall, their spines worn from repeated reading. A large stone fireplace dominated the main room, and above it hung a painting of the mesa country at sunset, capturing the land's harsh beauty with unexpected skill. "My mother painted that," Catherine said, noticing his gaze. "Before the consumption took her 6 years ago, she loved this country, even when it tried to kill her with dust and heat and loneliness." An older man emerged from what appeared to be a study, moving with the careful precision of someone whose body had been broken and mended more than once. Thomas Bennett was perhaps 60, his hair gone silver but still thick, his face deeply lined by sun and hardship. He walked with a pronounced limp, leaning on a cane carved from juniper wood. "Father, this is Daniel Running Wolf," Catherine said. "He's the one who stopped Wade Garrison and his friends from burning our south fence line." Thomas Bennett's eyes, the same clear grey as his daughter's, studied Daniel with an intensity that felt like being weighed and measured. Daniel had been examined by plenty of white men before, usually with suspicion or contempt. This felt different, more analytical, as though Bennett were trying to solve a problem rather than confirm a prejudice. "Running Wolf," Thomas said finally, his voice gravelly but strong. "I knew Joshua Running Wolf years back. Trapper worked the high country around Taos. Married an Apache woman from the Mescalero people. Any relation?" Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. "My father. He disappeared into the mountains 15 years ago. Never came back," Thomas nodded slowly. "Joshua was a good man, honest in his dealings, which is rarer than it should be in this territory. If you're his son, you've got decent blood in you, regardless of what small-minded folks might think." He gestured toward the table. "Sit. Anyone who protects my property and my daughter earns a meal and a conversation." Daniel hesitated, but Catherine was already moving toward the kitchen, and Thomas had lowered himself into a chair, with the relief of someone whose leg pained him constantly. Refusing would be insulting, and Daniel had been raised with enough of both cultures to understand that hospitality, once offered, created obligations. He sat. Catherine returned with 3 cups of coffee and a plate of cornbread still warm from the oven. She took the chair across from Daniel while her father sat at the head of the table, his cane propped within easy reach. "Tell me what happened," Thomas said, wrapping his weathered hands around the coffee cup. Daniel recounted the encounter in town. Wade's drunken planning, the confrontation at the fence line. He kept his telling sparse, factual, omitting his own uncertainty about why he'd involved himself. When he finished, Thomas and Catherine exchanged a look that spoke of shared knowledge and concern. "Wade Garrison," Thomas said with disgust. "Drunk more often than sober, bitter about every perceived slight, and convinced the world owes him success he's never earned. He worked for me 2 years ago, until I caught him stealing from the supply shed and beating a horse half to death because it spooked a snake. I dismissed him and testified to his character when he applied for work at the Patterson spread. He's blamed me ever since for his troubles. He's also convinced half the small ranchers in the valley that our expansion is squeezing them out," Catherine added. "Never mind that father bought his land legally, or that we've offered fair prices for water rights and grazing leases. Wade sees conspiracy where there's only commerce. The fences don't help," Thomas admitted. 10 years ago, this was all open range. A man could drive cattle from here to Colorado without encountering a single fence post. But barbed wire changed everything. I fenced our property to protect our breeding stock, to manage grazing, to build something permanent. Others saw it as theft, as if the land itself belonged to whoever wanted to use it, regardless of who held the deed. Daniel understood the conflict more deeply than either of them probably realized. His mother's people had watched the same transformation, seen the fences go up across lands they'd traveled for generations. The difference was that when Indians objected to fences, the army came with guns. When white ranchers objected, they organized committees and filed complaints with territorial governors. "Wade mentioned something about Catherine testifying," Daniel said. "What was that about?" Catherine's jaw tightened. 3 months ago, Wade and 2 other men were accused of rustling cattle from the Maxwell Ranch north of here. I saw them driving Maxwell cattle across our northern pasture at night. When the deputy came asking questions, I told him what I'd witnessed. Wade was arrested but released for lack of evidence. Apparently my testimony alone wasn't sufficient, being from a woman. He's been making threats ever since. Threats we reported to Sheriff Dalton, Thomas said, who assured us he'd handle it. Clearly, his handling amounts to nothing. A heavy silence settled over the table. Daniel drank his coffee, which was better than any he'd had in months, and tried to ignore the way Catherine's eyes kept returning to him with a curiosity that felt dangerous in ways he couldn't articulate. "Where were you headed?" Thomas asked abruptly. Before you decided to play guardian angel to strangers? North Colorado Territory. Thought I might find work in the mines or on the railroad. Running from something or towards something? The question was blunt but not unkind. Daniel considered how much truth to offer. Both, maybe. I don't fit comfortably in either world I was born into. Figured new territory might mean new possibilities. Thomas nodded as though this confirmed something he'd suspected. I know that feeling. I came west from Ohio 30 years ago because the life laid out for me, working in my father's textile mill, marrying the daughter of his business partner, inheriting a world of ledgers and factory smoke felt like a coffin closing around me. Out here, a man could remake himself, or so I thought. Did it work? Daniel asked. Some days? Thomas's smile was rueful. Other days, I wonder if we just carry our limitations with us, and geography doesn't change the fundamental problems of being human. But I built something here. The ranch, a life with my wife before she died, and Catherine, who's worth more than all the cattle and land combined. He looked at his daughter with obvious pride, and something else, concern, perhaps, or worry. Catherine rolled her eyes affectionately. Father, you're embarrassing me in front of our guest. Truth isn't embarrassing, girl. It just is, Thomas turned back to Daniel. You saved my property tonight, possibly more. Wade, in his current state of drunken grievance, might have done worse than burn fences. That creates a debt. No debt, Daniel said immediately. I did what seemed right at the moment. Nothing more, perhaps. But in this territory, debts are how we survive. The man who helped me when my leg was crushed under a fallen horse. The neighbor who brought food when my wife was dying. The Mexican family who found Catherine lost in the desert when she was 7. These debts tie us together. Make us something more than isolated individuals fighting the land alone. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. I appreciate the sentiment, but I'm not looking for ties. I'll be leaving at first light. And where? Catherine challenged. Back to town where the storekeeper won't sell to you? North to Colorado, where you'll be just another drifter hoping for work that probably isn't there. You intervened tonight, Daniel. Whether you wanted to or not, you've made enemies who won't forget your face. I've had enemies before, not like Wade Garrison. Her voice was flat, certain. He's the type who nurses grudges until they poison everything around him. You humiliated him in front of his friends. That's not something he'll let pass. Thomas was watching the exchange with interest, his eyes moving between Daniel and his daughter as though observing a chess match. Stay a few days, he said finally. We've got a bunkhouse with empty beds since most of the crew went north with the cattle drive. We can use an extra hand, and it gives Wade time to sober up and hopefully forget his plans for vengeance. And if he doesn't forget, then at least you'll have allies instead of facing whatever comes alone. Thomas stood, leaning heavily on his cane. I'm too old for false modesty or games, Running Wolf. You're skilled, that much is obvious. You're also at loose ends, whether you admit it or not. I could use someone I can trust, and trust is rarer than gold in this territory. Think about it. He limped toward his study, leaving Daniel alone with Catherine and the weight of an offer he hadn't expected. Catherine refilled their coffee cups from the pot on the stove. When she sat back down, her expression had shifted from the careful neutrality she'd maintained in her father's presence to something more direct, more challenging. You're wondering why we're being hospitable to a stranger, especially one with Apache blood. The thought had crossed my mind. My mother's sister married a mescalero man named Greyhawk. I spent summers with them when I was young, before the army forced most of the mescalero onto the reservation. Aunt Caroline died there of influenza. Greyhawk disappeared one winter, went into the mountains and never returned, just like your father. Her voice carried old grief, carefully contained. My mother never recovered from losing her sister. She painted that sunset the year before she died, said it reminded her of Caroline, beautiful and wild and impossible to hold on to. Daniel didn't know what to say. The revelation explained much about the Bennets' unexpected acceptance, but it also complicated things in ways he hadn't anticipated. That doesn't mean you owe me anything, he said finally. No, Catherine agreed. but it means I understand what it's like to exist between worlds, to be accepted in neither fully." She paused, studying him over the rim of her coffee cup. "Why did you really follow Wade tonight? And don't tell me you don't know. Nobody risks their life on impulse." Daniel looked down at his hands, the scars across his knuckles from a dozen fights, the calluses from years of hard work in places that never became home. "I saw something when I was 14. Raiders attacked an Apache camp where I was staying. I hid in the rocks while they—" He stopped, the memory still too sharp even after all these years. "I did nothing. I was young, untrained, terrified. But I've never forgotten how helpless I felt, watching violence unfold and being unable to stop it. So tonight was about redemption. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just tired of walking past trouble and pretending it's not my concern." Catherine set down her cup. "Then stay. Not because of any debt, but because walking away means you'll just find different trouble somewhere else. At least here, you'll know what you're fighting." Before Daniel could respond, the sound of hoofbeats approaching fast shattered the quiet. Catherine was on her feet immediately, grabbing her rifle from where it leaned against the wall. Daniel's hand went to his knife as Thomas emerged from his study, a revolver in his hand despite his limp. The door burst open without a knock. A young man stumbled in, his face flushed with exertion, his horse still blowing hard outside. "Miss Bennett, Mr. Bennett, Wade's back and he's brought others. At least a dozen men, maybe more. They're at the south fence line and they're armed." Catherine's face went pale, but her voice remained steady. "Martinez, where are Cole and Deacon?" "Checking the north pasture. I tried to signal them, but they're too far out. It's just us." Martinez's eyes found Daniel, widened slightly in confusion. "Who's this?" "Reinforcements," Thomas said grimly. He moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. In the distance, the flicker of torches was visible, moving toward the ranch buildings like malevolent fireflies. They're not even hiding their intent. Wade must be drunk enough to think numbers will protect him from consequences, or angry enough not to care about the consequences, Catherine added. She checked her rifle's load with practiced efficiency. "We've got maybe 10 minutes before they reach the house." Daniel moved to the window beside Thomas. The line of torches was spreading out, a coordinated approach meant to attack from multiple angles. Whoever was organizing this raid had more tactical sense than Wade had demonstrated earlier. "There's at least 15 men," Daniel observed. "Too many to hold off from the house alone, especially if they fire the outbuildings. The flames would drive you out. So what do you suggest?" Thomas asked. "We can't run, I'm too slow, and this is my land. I won't be driven from it by drunken cowards." Daniel's mind raced through possibilities, drawing on tactics he'd learned from his mother's people, strategies for facing superior numbers with limited resources. The ranch's layout offered some advantages. The house was built of thick adobe that wouldn't burn easily, the corrals could provide cover, and the approaching raiders would be silhouetted against their own torches. "We don't hold the house," Daniel said. "We use it as bait." Catherine and Martinez stay inside, visible through the windows, making it look like you're preparing to defend from here. Thomas and I move to the barn. It's got a clear line of fire to anyone approaching the house, and they won't expect resistance from behind. "You're asking me to use my daughter as bait," Thomas said, his voice dangerous. "I'm asking you to trust that she can handle a rifle and that I won't let anyone reach the house." Daniel turned to face the older man directly. "You offered me work and trust. I'm offering you a plan that might save your ranch and your lives, but it only works if you trust me." Catherine stepped between them. "It's a good plan, Father. Daniel's right. They'll focus on the house because that's where they expect us to be. If we can break their advance before they get close enough to fire the outbuildings, we end this without anyone dying. And if it doesn't work, then we fight from the house like you planned." She met her father's eyes steadily. "But I'd rather have someone with Daniel's skills on our side than stubbornly refuse help because of pride." Thomas looked between his daughter and the stranger who'd appeared in their lives just hours ago. The torches were closer now, close enough that Daniel could hear voices shouting encouragement to each other, working up the courage that violence required. "Fine. Thomas said finally. "But if anything happens to her, Running Wolf, there won't be anywhere in this territory you can hide from me." Understood. They moved quickly. Catherine and Martinez positioned themselves at windows on opposite sides of the house, their rifles visible to anyone watching. Thomas and Daniel slipped out the back, moving through shadows toward the barn. Thomas's limp slowed them, but the older man managed better than Daniel expected, using his cane to maintain balance while carrying his revolver in his free hand. The barn was dark and smelled of horses and hay. Daniel led Thomas to the loft, where gaps between the boards provided clear sight lines to the approaching raiders. They settled into position, Thomas breathing hard from the climb, Daniel counting the torches and marking their positions. 16 men, Daniel murmured. Wade's in front, using his rage to lead the others. They'll hit the house from 3 sides, main group at the front, smaller groups at each corner. Classic mob tactics. You've seen this before. Different circumstances. Same principle. Mobs feel brave when they're together, but they break easily once casualties start. Thomas was quiet for a moment. "You know we might have to kill some of them." "I know. Do you have a problem with that?" "I have a problem with Wade Garrison forcing my hand into killing men I've known for years. Men who have let their resentment and his whiskey convince them that arson and violence are justified." Thomas checked his revolver's cylinder. "But I'll do what's necessary to protect my daughter and my land." The raiders were close enough now that Daniel could make out individual faces in the torchlight. Wade was indeed at the front, his earlier injury apparently forgotten or irrelevant in his drunken fury. The men with him were a mix, some young and stupid, some older and bitter, all of them convinced they were righteous in their grievance. "Bennett," Wade's voice carried across the yard. "Send out that Indian who attacked us, and we'll forget about your fences and your daughter's lies. Otherwise, we're coming in, and what happens is in your head." Catherine appeared at the front window, her rifle clearly visible. "Wade Garrison, you're drunk and trespassing. Take your men and leave before someone gets hurt. The only one getting hurt is that savage you're harboring," Wade shouted back. "We know he's in there. We saw his horse." "What you saw was a man protecting property from criminals. The same criminals who are now threatening to burn down my home. The sheriff will hear about this, Wade." "The sheriff isn't here," Wade said, and his grin was visible even at this distance. "And by the time he arrives, there won't be anything left but ashes and a lesson about interfering in matters that don't concern savages who should have been driven out years ago." He raised his torch, a signal Daniel recognized. This was the moment. Wade would throw the first torch, and the others would follow, emboldened by their leader's action. Daniel sighted along his rifle, aiming not at Wade, but at the torch in his hand. A difficult shot in uncertain light, but possible. He steadied his breathing, centered himself the way his Apache grandfather had taught him during the handful of years he'd spent among his mother's people. The torch arced through the air. Daniel's shot cracked through the night, impossibly precise. The torch exploded in mid-flight, showering sparks that fell harmlessly to the dirt. Wade stumbled backward in shock, staring at his empty hand as though it had betrayed him. "Next shot won't be at the torch," Daniel called out from the barn, his voice carrying with cold authority. "It'll be at the man holding it. Leave now, and you'll live to regret your stupidity. Stay, and you'll just die stupid." Confusion rippled through the raiders. They'd expected a siege, a chance to overwhelm the house with numbers and courage borrowed from whiskey. They hadn't expected resistance from an unexpected angle or marksmanship that could shoot a torch out of the air. "He's bluffing," Wade shouted, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "There's only one of him. Rush the house." 3 men started forward. Daniel fired twice more, not at them, but at the ground directly in front of their feet, sending up geysers of dirt that stopped them cold. Thomas fired as well, his shot careful and deliberate, designed to intimidate rather than kill. The raiders' advance faltered. Daniel could see the calculation in their faces. Was whatever grievance they harbored worth dying for? In the uncertain torchlight, facing accurate fire from an unseen position, the answer was becoming clear. "This is your last warning," Daniel called out. The next person who moves toward the house gets shot, and I don't miss. Listen to him, Wade, one of the older men said, loudly enough for Daniel to hear. This was supposed to be easy. Burn some fences, scare Bennett. Nobody said anything about getting killed by some Indian sharpshooter. Coward! Wade spat. A live coward beats a dead fool, the man replied, already backing away. I'm done. His departure broke the mob's cohesion. One by one, then in groups, the raiders began to retreat, their torches bobbing as they moved back toward where they'd left their horses. Wade stood alone for a long moment, his fury evident in every line of his body. Before finally turning and following his scattered army into the darkness, Daniel kept his rifle trained on them until the last torch disappeared from view. Only then did he lower his weapon and turn to Thomas, who was slumped against a hay bale, his face grey with pain. Your leg? The damn thing always hurts worse when the weather's about to change. Thomas managed a weak smile. But I'll live, which is more than I expected 10 minutes ago. That shooting, where did you learn that? My mother's father. He could shoot the eye out of a hawk at 100 yards. Said it wasn't about the weapon, but about becoming still enough to let the shot find its own way. They climbed down from the loft carefully, Thomas's limp even more pronounced now. When they emerged from the barn, Catherine and Martinez were already outside, and Catherine was running toward them with her rifle still in hand. She stopped directly in front of Daniel, her chest heaving from exertion or emotion or both. That shot with the torch, I've never seen anything like that. Lucky, Daniel said. Don't insult my intelligence. She was close enough now that he could see the gold flecks in her grey eyes, could smell the faint scent of sage that clung to her hair. You saved our home, our lives, again. How exactly do you expect us to repay that kind of debt? Catherine, Thomas began, but she cut him off with a gesture. No, father. Daniel needs to understand something. In our family, debts are sacred. He's risked his life twice in one night for people he doesn't know. That creates an obligation we can't simply dismiss with thanks and a handshake. Daniel felt trapped by her intensity, by the way she was looking at him as though he'd done something heroic rather than simply tactical. I don't want an obligation. I want to collect my horse and be gone before Wade comes back with reinforcements, or the sheriff arrives asking uncomfortable questions. Then you'll want to hear what I'm about to say, Thomas interrupted, his voice carrying a note of decision that made both Daniel and Catherine turn toward him. Because it's the only solution that protects all of us and might actually keep Wade and his friends from trying this again. The old rancher looked between them, his expression calculating, measuring, and somehow sad. When he spoke again, his words would alter the course of all their lives in ways none of them could fully anticipate. Catherine, you're going to marry Daniel Running Wolf. The words hung in the night air like smoke from the departed torches, impossible to dispel or ignore. Catherine's face went through a series of expressions, shock, confusion, then something Daniel couldn't quite identify before she settled on carefully controlled composure. Father, you can't be serious. I'm absolutely serious. Thomas limped toward the house, gesturing for them to follow. Inside, we need to discuss this rationally, not standing in the yard where anyone with a rifle and a grudge could pick us off. Martinez, who had witnessed the entire exchange, wisely excused himself to check on the horses, disappearing toward the bunkhouse with the hasty retreat of someone who recognized family business when he heard it. Daniel stood frozen, certain he'd misheard or misunderstood. But Catherine's expression told him otherwise. Inside, Thomas settled into his chair with a grunt of pain, while Catherine paced before the fireplace like a caged mountain lion. Daniel remained standing near the door, every instinct screaming at him to leave immediately, to mount Whisper and ride until the Bennett ranch was nothing but an uncomfortable memory. You can't arrange my marriage like I'm some kind of property, Catherine said, her voice tight with controlled anger. This isn't the 18th century, Father. Women have rights now, choices, and I'm giving you a choice, Thomas interrupted. Listen to what I'm proposing before you reject it out of hand. He turned to Daniel. Sit down, Running Wolf. You're making me nervous, hovering by the door like you're about to bolt. Daniel sat, but only because his legs felt suddenly unsteady. Marriage, the word itself felt foreign, impossible. He'd spent his adult life avoiding exactly this kind of entanglement, the roots that tied a man to one place, a set of obligations he couldn't simply ride away from. Thomas poured himself a whiskey from a bottle on the sideboard, offering the same to Daniel, who declined with a shake of his head. Catherine continued pacing, her jaw set in a way that reminded Daniel eerily of her father. "The situation is this," Thomas began, his tone shifting into something more businesslike, as though he were discussing cattle prices rather than his daughter's future. "Wade Garrison has now twice attempted to destroy my property, and tonight he brought 15 men with him. That kind of organization, that kind of support, means this isn't just one drunk's vendetta anymore. It's become a cause for every small rancher and bitter cowhand who resents my success. So hire more men," Catherine said. "Bring the crew back from Colorado, increase security, and escalate this into a range war? Watch men I've employed for years kill neighbors they've known even longer?" Thomas shook his head. "That's not the legacy I want to leave. But I also can't leave you vulnerable, Catherine. I won't always be here. This leg isn't getting better, and my heart isn't as strong as it was. You'll inherit this ranch, all of it, and the target that comes with it. I know you can handle yourself. You're twice as capable as most men I've met. But capability doesn't stop a bullet from ambush or a torch thrown in the night when you're alone." Thomas's voice softened. "Your mother made me promise before she died that I'd see you protected and settled. I've put it off because you're so damned independent, but tonight made me realize I can't wait any longer." Daniel found his voice finally. "And how exactly does marrying me solve any of this? If anything, it'll make things worse. A white woman marrying an Apache. That'll give Wade and his friends even more ammunition for their grievances." "On the contrary," Thomas said, leaning forward with the intensity of a man who'd clearly thought this through. "It solves multiple problems at once. First, Catherine gains a husband with demonstrated ability to protect this property. Your skills tonight weren't luck, Running Wolf. You're trained, competent, and more importantly, you're not part of the established rancher hierarchy that Wade resents. You're an outsider, which means you don't bring old feuds or alliances to complicate matters. Father, this is insane. Second," Thomas continued, ignoring his daughter's protest, "it addresses the legal complications of Catherine inheriting. A woman rancher is unusual enough to draw unwanted attention from men who think they can push her aside or marry her for her property. A married woman with a husband actively managing the ranch alongside her presents a very different proposition. The law, unfortunately, still favors married women over single ones in property disputes." Daniel's mind was reeling. "You're suggesting a business arrangement disguised as marriage." "I'm suggesting a practical solution to multiple problems." Thomas met his gaze steadily. "You need a place, Running Wolf. Don't pretend otherwise. You've been drifting for years, running from a past you can't escape and toward a future that doesn't exist. Here you could have purpose, land, a life that means something more than just survival. And what do I get?" Catherine demanded, stopping her pacing to face her father directly. "A stranger as a husband? Someone I met mere hours ago? What about love, partnership, the things Mother always said made her marriage to you worth all the hardship?" Thomas's expression softened, grief flickering across his weathered features. "Your mother and I were lucky. We had love, yes, but we also had respect, shared purpose, and the willingness to build something together. Those things matter more than the romantic notion of love at first sight. They're what sustain a marriage through the hard years, and this territory promises plenty of hard years. So I'm supposed to just accept this, marry a man I don't know because it's practical?" Catherine's voice cracked slightly, revealing the fear beneath her anger. "I'm asking you to consider it," Thomas said quietly. "Not as a father commanding his daughter, but as a man who's seen enough of life to recognize opportunity when it presents itself. Daniel saved our lives tonight. He's capable, honorable despite what this territory might think of his heritage, and he's someone I believe I can trust. That's a rare combination. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of a clock on the mantel and the distant sound of horses settling in the corrals. Daniel looked between father and daughter, seeing the genuine concern in Thomas's face and the conflicting emotions warring across Catherine's features. "I need to think," Catherine said finally. It's too much, too fast." "Take the night," Thomas agreed. "But Wade won't wait long before he tries again, and next time he'll be smarter about it. We need a solution, and soon." Catherine turned and walked toward the stairs leading to the second floor, her spine rigid with controlled emotion. Halfway up, she paused and looked back at Daniel. "Did you know? When you followed Wade from town, did you have any idea it would lead to this?" "No," Daniel said honestly. "If I had, I would have kept riding." Something flickered in her eyes, hurt maybe, or recognition of an honesty that matched her own. Then she continued upstairs, and Daniel heard a door close firmly in the distance. Thomas poured himself another whiskey. "She'll come around." Catherine's practical, beneath all that pride and independence. "She knows I'm right, even if she doesn't want to admit it yet." "And if she doesn't?" Daniel asked. "If she refuses, then you'll ride out tomorrow, and we'll face whatever comes next as best we can." Thomas studied him over his glass. "But I don't think you want to ride out. Running Wolf, I think part of you, maybe the part that followed Wade tonight, is tired of running and looking for a reason to stop." Daniel had no answer to that, because the old rancher might be right. He'd been running for so long that the idea of staying anywhere, let alone marrying into a situation as complicated as this, should have been unthinkable. Yet he hadn't left. He'd stayed for dinner, stayed to fight off raiders, and he was still sitting here considering an arrangement that made no logical sense. "I'll sleep on it," Daniel said, standing. "But I'm not making any promises." "Fair enough. Martinez will show you to the bunkhouse. We'll talk more in the morning." The bunkhouse was a long, low building with a dozen beds lined against the walls. Most were empty, testament to the crew that had gone north with the cattle drive. Martinez showed Daniel to a bed at the far end, provided him with blankets, and tactfully asked no questions about what had been discussed in the main house. Daniel lay on the narrow cot, staring at the ceiling beams barely visible in the darkness. Through the small window, he could see stars scattered across the sky, the same stars his mother had taught him to read, to use for navigation and for understanding the seasons. She told him stories beneath those stars, legends of his people that felt increasingly distant from the life he'd lived since her death. Marriage. The word kept returning. Impossible to dismiss. He'd never seriously considered it, had convinced himself that his mixed heritage and wandering life made such permanence unthinkable. Yet Thomas Bennett's proposal had a certain brutal logic to it. A home, purpose, the chance to build something instead of endlessly running from shadows and memories. And Catherine. He barely knew her, yet something in her fierce independence and practical competence resonated with him. She wasn't afraid, wasn't helpless, wasn't looking for rescue. She was looking for partnership, even if she didn't fully realize it yet. Sleep refused to come. Eventually, Daniel rose and walked outside into the cool night air. The ranch was quiet now, peaceful, with no hint of the violence that had threatened just hours earlier. He found himself walking toward the corrals where Whisper stood among the Bennett horses, her paint coloring distinctive even in darkness. Thinking of leaving? He turned to find Catherine sitting on the corral fence, barely visible in her dark clothing against the night sky. She'd changed from her work clothes into a simple dress, her hair loose around her shoulders in a way that made her look younger, more vulnerable than the woman who'd faced down armed raiders with a rifle. Considering it, Daniel admitted, moving to lean against the fence beside her. "Your father makes a compelling argument, but compelling doesn't mean right." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." She was quiet for a moment, watching the horses. "He does this, you know. Sees a problem and immediately calculates the most efficient solution, regardless of the human complications involved. When my mother was dying, he wanted to send me east to live with relatives, thought it would spare me the pain of watching her decline. Didn't occur to him that leaving would be worse than staying, that some pain is necessary because the alternative is abandoning the people you love. But you stayed. I stayed. Held her hand through the worst of it, read to her when she was too weak to hold a book, painted with her even when her hands could barely grip a brush. Catherine's voice was thick with old grief. Father meant well, but he didn't understand that efficiency isn't always kindness. Daniel heard the unspoken message. You think his marriage proposal is the same thing? Well-intentioned, but ultimately wrong. I don't know what I think. She turned to look at him directly, and even in the poor light, he could see the intelligence in her eyes, the careful assessment. Tell me about yourself, Daniel Runningwolf. Not the facts Father already knows, but the things that matter. Why do you really drift? What are you running from? The question was more intimate than any marriage proposal could be, asking for truth rather than convenience. Daniel found himself answering with an honesty that surprised him. I'm running from the impossibility of belonging anywhere. My mother's people see me as too white. White society sees me as too Indian. I've tried living in both worlds and found I'm welcome in neither. He paused, the old pain surfacing. When I was 17, I tried to join my mother's band on the reservation. Thought maybe there I could finally be just myself, not a curiosity or a problem. But even there I was different. The young men resented that I'd been raised partly white, thought I'd been softened by it. The elders respected my mother's memory, but couldn't forget my father's blood. After a year I left because staying meant being forever the half-breed who didn't quite fit. Catherine listened without interrupting, her attention complete in a way few people had ever offered him. When he finished, she nodded slowly. I understand that more than you might think. After my mother died, there were men in Mesa Ridge who suddenly saw me as available, as property to be acquired along with Father's ranch. They'd come calling with false sympathy and real ambition, talking to Father about mergers and partnerships while looking at me like I was livestock. When I rejected them, I became difficult, unmarriageable, a woman who didn't know her place. She smiled without humor. So I made myself indispensable to the ranch operations, learned everything Father could teach me about breeding cattle, managing land, reading market trends. Thought if I proved my competence, they'd leave me alone. Did it work? It made things worse. Now I'm not just unmarriageable, I'm a threat. A woman who can run a ranch as well as any man, who doesn't need a husband to manage her inheritance. Men like Wade resent that almost as much as they resent Father's success. They stood in companionable silence, two people who understood what it meant to exist outside the neat categories society preferred. A coyote called in the distance, its lonely cry echoing across the mesa. Whisper nickered softly, and Catherine reached out to stroke the mare's nose. She's beautiful, Catherine said. Paint horses are sacred to some tribes, aren't they? My mother's people believed they carried the spirits of both day and night, could walk between worlds. Daniel ran his hand along Whisper's neck. I bought her from a Mexican rancher who was going to put her down because she was too stubborn to break properly. It took me 3 months to earn her trust. Stubborn creatures recognize their own kind, Catherine said with a slight smile. Then her expression turned serious again. If we did this, and I'm not saying we will, what would it actually mean? Would you expect a real marriage with all that implies? Or would it be purely practical, a partnership in name only? The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither seemed ready to fully explore. Daniel chose his words carefully. I won't lie to you, Catherine. If we marry, I'd want it to be real eventually. Not immediately, not until we've earned each other's trust and respect. But I'm not interested in a permanent charade where we sleep in separate rooms and live separate lives while pretending to be married for appearances. He met her gaze steadily. That said, I also won't force anything. Building something real takes time, and time is something we'd have if we make this choice. Catherine absorbed this, her expression thoughtful rather than alarmed. That's fair, I suppose. More honest than I expected, actually. Your father is right about one thing, Daniel continued. I am tired of running. I've been doing it for 10 years. and all it's earned me is loneliness and the certain knowledge that geography doesn't solve fundamental problems. Maybe it's time to try something different. Maybe it's time to stand and build instead of endlessly searching for a place that doesn't exist. And you think that place could be here? With me, with this ranch, with all the complications that come with being married to a woman who shoots better than most men and has strong opinions about nearly everything? Despite the gravity of their conversation, Daniel found himself almost smiling. I think if I'm going to stop running, I'd rather do it alongside someone who doesn't need rescuing, who can stand beside me rather than behind me. Your father called you capable. I think he undersold it considerably. Catherine did smile then, genuine warmth breaking through her careful control. Flattery, Mr. Running Wolf. I wouldn't have expected that. Not flattery. Assessment. He turned to face her fully. I'll be honest with you, Catherine. This scares me. The idea of staying, of committing to something permanent, of trusting that this time might be different, all of it terrifies me in ways that facing armed raiders doesn't. But I'm willing to try if you are. Not because your father thinks it's practical, but because I think we might actually be able to build something worth having. She studied him for a long moment, and Daniel had the sense of being weighed and measured against some internal standard only she knew. Finally, she extended her hand toward him, not in the feminine way women were taught to offer their hands to men, but in the firm, direct manner of someone offering a partnership between equals. Let's try, she said simply. Not because it's practical, or because father thinks it's wise, but because maybe we both deserve a chance to stop running and start building. Her grip was strong when he took her hand. But I have conditions. I'd be disappointed if you didn't. First, we wait 2 weeks before any ceremony. That gives us time to know each other better, to make sure this isn't just a reaction to a crisis. If either of us has doubts, we can end it without obligation. Agreed. Second, this ranch belongs to both of us if we marry. Not me under your authority, not you working for my father, but genuine partnership. I make decisions, you make decisions, and we figure out how to compromise when we disagree. That's actually what I'd prefer. Third, we're honest with each other, even when it's uncomfortable. No pretending, no hiding behind propriety or gender expectations. If this is going to work, it has to be built on truth. Daniel nodded. Those are all reasonable conditions. I have one of my own, which is, we defend this ranch together, but we also build something beyond just defense. I won't live my life in a constant state of siege, always waiting for the next Wade garrison to come with torches. We find a way to make peace with the valley, to address the legitimate grievances, even while standing firm against violence. Catherine considered this. That won't be easy. Some men won't accept anything less than our complete defeat. Maybe not. But I'd rather try and fail than succeed at building a fortress where we're safe but isolated, protected but alone. She looked at him with new respect, as though this condition revealed something about his character she'd been hoping to find. Then we have an agreement, at least to try. She released his hand but didn't step away. 2 weeks. Get to know each other, work together, see if this partnership has any hope of becoming something real. And at the end of 2 weeks, we decide together. No pressure from father, no obligation beyond what we choose for ourselves. Catherine turned to walk back toward the house, then paused. Thank you, Daniel. For what? For not treating me like property to be acquired or a problem to be solved. For offering partnership instead of ownership. Her smile was visible even in the darkness. It's rarer than you might think. She walked away, leaving Daniel alone with the horses and his own racing thoughts. The coyote called again, closer now, and Whisper pressed her nose against his shoulder in a gesture of companionship. Above, the stars continued their eternal rotation, indifferent to human dramas, yet somehow comforting in their constancy. 2 weeks. 14 days to determine if running could truly end, if belonging was possible, if two people who'd spent their lives on the outside could build something together that neither could build alone. It seemed both impossibly short and dangerously long. Daniel finally returned to the bunkhouse as false dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. Martinez was already awake, building up the fire in the small stove, and he glanced at Daniel with curiosity, but asked no questions. In a few hours, the sun would rise fully, bringing with it the first day of this unexpected trial. He lay back on the narrow cot, exhaustion finally overtaking the tumult in his mind. His last thought before sleep claimed him was of Catherine's hand in his, the firm grip of someone offering partnership, and the unexpected possibility that perhaps finally he'd found a place worth staying for. The ranch would wake soon to new arrangements, new possibilities, and new dangers. But for now, there was only rest, and the fragile hope that sometimes salvation did come from unexpected places, wearing unexpected faces, offering chances that seemed impossible until you reached out and took them. The first week passed in a blur of work and wary assessment. Daniel threw himself into ranch operations with an intensity that surprised even Thomas, who'd seen his share of dedicated workers over the years. He rose before dawn to help Martinez with the horses, spent mornings mending fence lines that Wade's earlier attempt had weakened, and devoted afternoons to learning the intricacies of cattle management that differed significantly from the horses he'd worked with in his travels. Catherine watched him with the careful attention of someone evaluating a business investment, which Daniel supposed he was. She accompanied him on his rounds, ostensibly to show him the property boundaries, but he suspected she was really measuring his character against some private standard. They spoke little during these rides, but the silence felt companionable rather than hostile. Two people learning each other's rhythms without forcing intimacy that hadn't been earned. On the 8th day, everything changed. Daniel was in the north pasture, replacing a broken post, when he noticed fresh tracks in the soft earth near the creek. Bootprints, 3 distinct sets, moving deliberately along the fence line, as though examining it for weaknesses. The prints were recent, made within the last few hours, based on how the edges held their shape in the morning moisture. He followed the tracks for half a mile before they diverged from the property, heading toward the rocky hills that formed the northern boundary of Bennett land. Someone was surveying the ranch, mapping its vulnerabilities, and doing so with enough skill to avoid the main trails where they'd be easily spotted. Daniel backtracked to where Whisper waited, his mind calculating possibilities. Wade Garrison was too impulsive, too openly hostile to engage in patient reconnaissance. This suggested someone else, someone with military training or extensive experience in tactics that required planning over passion. He found Catherine in the barn, working with a young colt that needed breaking. She tied her hair back with a leather cord, and her shirt was damp with sweat, despite the cool morning air. The colt, a spirited bay with intelligent eyes, was responding to her patient guidance with the gradual surrender of an animal learning to trust. "We have a problem," Daniel said without preamble. Catherine's hands never stopped their gentle work on the colt's halter, but her attention shifted immediately. "What kind of problem?" "Someone's been surveying our north fence line. 3 men, moving carefully, staying off the main trails. They know what they're doing, which means this isn't Wade's usual drunken impulsiveness." Now Catherine did stop, her expression shifting from calm to concerned. "Show me." They rode north together, Catherine on her mare Promise, while Daniel guided Whisper. The tracks were still visible when they reached the creek, and Catherine dismounted to examine them more closely, running her fingers along the boot prints with the same careful attention she'd given the colt. "These are cavalry boots," she said finally. "See the distinctive heel pattern? That's an army issue, probably within the last 5 years. She looked up at Daniel, genuine worry creasing her brow. "Why would former soldiers be scouting our property?" "Maybe they're not the former," Daniel suggested. "Fort Selden isn't that far south. Could be active in the military, moonlighting for whoever's willing to pay. That makes no sense. Why would the army involve itself in a local ranching dispute? Maybe they wouldn't, but individual soldiers might. Especially if someone convinced them there was Apache trouble on a civilian ranch that needed addressing. The implication hung between them, ugly and dangerous. Catherine's face hardened. You think someone's trying to frame this as an Indian problem? Use your presence here to justify military intervention? It's a theory. One way to get rid of both your father's resistance to selling and my inconvenient existence would be to create a situation where the army feels obligated to step in. Catherine remounted Promise, her movements sharp with anger. We need to tell father. If there's a larger conspiracy involving military personnel, this is beyond Wade's petty vengeance. They rode hard back to the main house, where Thomas was reviewing ledgers in his study. His expression darkened as they explained what Daniel had found, and he reached immediately for the gun belt hanging on a hook beside his desk. We go to Sheriff Dalton, Thomas said, buckling the belt despite the awkwardness caused by his limp. If soldiers are involved, even corrupt ones, this needs to be documented with legal authority. Dalton has ignored every complaint we've filed about Wade, Catherine protested. What makes you think he'll take this seriously? Because military involvement changes everything. Dalton might tolerate local feuding, but even he knows that soldiers committing crimes off-duty is federal jurisdiction. He'll want to distance himself from this before it becomes his problem. They made the ride to Mesa Ridge in tense silence, arriving at the sheriff's office just before noon. The building was modest. 2 cells in the back, a desk and gun rack in the front, wanted posters covering one wall with faces that meant nothing to Daniel. Sheriff Dalton himself was behind the desk, a heavy-set man in his 50s whose badge seemed more ornamental than functional. He looked up as they entered, his expression souring immediately when he saw Daniel. Bennett, Miss Catherine, and I see you've brought your new pet Indian. Heard rumors you were harboring him despite the trouble he caused Wade Garrison. The trouble Wade caused himself, Thomas corrected sharply. But we're not here about that. We have evidence of armed men conducting surveillance on my property. Professional reconnaissance, possibly involving military personnel. Dalton leaned back in his chair, his skepticism evident. That's a serious accusation, Bennett. You have proof? Daniel stepped forward, describing the tracks, their pattern, the distinctive boot prints. As he spoke, he watched Dalton's face carefully, noting the slight shift in the sheriff's expression. Not surprise, but recognition quickly concealed. The lawman knew something, or had been told something, and was calculating how much to reveal. I'll look into it, Dalton said finally, his tone suggesting the investigation would be perfunctory at best. But Bennett, you need to consider that harboring a half-breed is going to draw unwanted attention. People are talking, saying your daughter's been seen riding alone with him, spending time in ways that aren't proper. If you're smart, you'll send him on his way before this situation escalates further. Daniel Runningwolf is under my protection, Thomas said coldly, and in 9 days he'll be my son-in-law. Catherine and I are announcing their engagement this Sunday at church. Anyone who has a problem with that can address it to me directly. The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. They'd agreed to keep the arrangement quiet during their 2-week trial, to avoid public pressure until they'd made their final decision. Thomas had just eliminated that option, forcing the issue into the open before either Daniel or Catherine had confirmed they wanted to proceed. Dalton's face reddened. You're marrying your daughter to an Indian? Bennett, have you lost your mind? The scandal alone will demonstrate that I value character over prejudice, Thomas interrupted. Daniel saved our lives and our property. He's shown more honor in 1 week than most of the so-called civilized men in this valley have shown in years. If that offends the sensibilities of Mesa Ridge, then Mesa Ridge can adjust its sensibilities. Catherine stood frozen beside Daniel, her face pale but her spine rigid. She hadn't contradicted her father's announcement, which meant she was either in shock or had known this was coming. Daniel suspected the latter, which meant he'd been outmaneuvered by both Bennetts in a strategy he'd never seen developing. Dalton stood, his hand resting on his gun belt in a gesture that wasn't quite threatening, but wasn't friendly either. You're making a mistake, Bennett. A bad one. This town won't accept it, and neither will the men who've been patient with your expansion until now. You're drawing a line you might not want drawn. The line was drawn when Wade Garrison brought 15 men to burn my home. Thomas replied. Everything since then has been deciding which side of that line people stand on. Now, if you'll excuse us, Sheriff, we have an engagement to announce. They left the office, Daniel's mind reeling. Outside, the street was quiet in the midday heat, but he could feel eyes watching from windows, from the shaded porch of the general store, from the saloon where men nursed their drinks and nursed their resentments. Word would spread fast. The Bennett girl marrying a half-breed, the old rancher losing his mind, the final proof that the Bennetts thought themselves above the rules that governed decent society. Why? Daniel asked once they were mounted and riding out of town. The single word carried all his confusion and anger. Thomas answered without slowing his horse. Because waiting 2 weeks would have given our enemies time to act. Better to force the issue now, when we control the narrative, than to let them frame the story first. By Sunday, everyone in Mesa Ridge will know you're marrying Catherine. That makes you a family, not just a drifter who can be run off without consequences. You should have consulted us, Catherine said, her voice tight. Would you have agreed? That's not the point, Father. You made a decision that affects both of us without giving us a voice. That's exactly the kind of high-handed behavior that makes people resent you. Thomas finally slowed his horse, turning to face them both. You're right. I apologize. But I also won't apologize for protecting my daughter and securing the ranch's future. Daniel, I saw how you looked at those tracks this morning. You're already thinking like someone who belongs here, someone defending his home. And Catherine, you've spent every evening this week finding excuses to check on Daniel, making sure he has what he needs, asking his opinion on ranch decisions. You're already acting like partners. I just made it official before circumstances could interfere. Daniel exchanged a glance with Catherine, seeing his own conflicted emotions reflected in her face. Thomas was right, damn him. The 2-week trial had been more formality than genuine uncertainty. They'd both already made their decisions, even if neither had been ready to voice them aloud. We'll discuss this at home, Catherine said finally. But Father, no more surprises. If we're doing this, we do it as equals, with honest communication. Agreed. Agreed, Thomas said, though his expression suggested he'd make that promise again when necessary, definitions of necessary being entirely his own. They rode in silence until the ranch buildings came into view. Martinez was waiting in the yard, his face grave, a piece of paper clutched in his hand. This was pinned to the barn door, he said, handing the paper to Thomas. Found it about an hour ago. Daniel read over Thomas's shoulder, his stomach sinking with each word. Bennett, your protection of the Apache savage is an insult to every decent family in this valley. Your daughter's rumored association with him is a stain on her honor and yours. We give you one final warning. Send Running Wolf away by Sunday, or face the consequences of your arrogance. This is not a threat. This is a promise. Concerned citizens of Mesa Ridge. The note was unsigned beyond the generic attribution, but the message was clear. Someone had learned of the engagement before Thomas had even announced it publicly, which meant either Dalton had sent word immediately, or there was someone closer feeding information to their enemies. Martinez, Thomas said sharply. Where were you when this was posted? North pasture, fixing the fence line Daniel marked yesterday. Cole and Deacon were at the South Range. The house was empty for maybe 2 hours. Martinez looked genuinely distressed. I'm sorry, Mr. Bennett. I should have stayed closer. Not your fault. They were watching, waiting for an opportunity. Thomas crumpled the paper, his jaw set. But this confirms what Daniel suspected. This isn't random harassment anymore. Someone's orchestrating this, coordinating responses faster than Wade Garrison's drunk brain could manage. A gunshot cracked across the valley, distant but distinct. Then another and another, 3 shots in rapid succession, the universal signal for trouble. The sound came from the South Range, where Cole and Deacon had gone to check on the breeding stock. Daniel was on whisper before conscious thought, Catherine right behind him on promise. They thundered south across the pasture, jumping a creek and dodging through scattered cattle that bellowed in alarm at their passage. Thomas followed at the best pace his leg would allow, with Martinez bringing up the rear. They found Cole lying near the fence line, blood spreading across his shirt from a wound in his shoulder. Deacon crouched beside him, his rifle scanning the rocky outcroppings where the shooter must have positioned himself. "Bushwhacked," Deacon said as they approached, his voice shaking with rage and adrenaline. "We were checking the water tank when someone opened fire from the rocks. Got Cole before we could even take cover. I returned fire, but whoever it was disappeared fast." Daniel dismounted, examining the blood trail that led from the rocks toward a ravine that would provide covered escape. The shooter had been professional, choosing a position with clear sight lines and an easy retreat, taking a single precise shot that disabled rather than killed, then vanishing before retaliation could arrive. Catherine knelt beside Cole, her hands already working to stanch the bleeding with a cloth torn from her shirt. "It went through clean," she said, her voice steady despite the violence. "Missed anything vital, but he needs a doctor." "I'll ride to town," Martinez offered. "Dr. Brennan should come if I tell him it's an emergency." "Go," Thomas said, finally arriving on his labored horse. "And Martinez, be careful. Whoever did this might be watching the road." As Martinez rode off, Daniel followed the blood trail to where it disappeared into the ravine. Bootprints, the same distinctive cavalry pattern he'd seen that morning. Whoever had scouted their property had returned with lethal intent, escalating from surveillance to violence in a matter of hours. He returned to find Catherine helping Cole to his feet, the older ranch hand pale but determined. "Did you see him?" Daniel asked. "Just a shape in the rocks," Cole said through gritted teeth. "But I heard something before the shot. Him talking to someone else, like he was confirming the target." "There were at least 2 men up there. A spotter and a shooter," Daniel said. "Military tactics. This wasn't Wade Garrison drunk and angry. This was planned, executed by someone with training." Thomas's face had gone gray, but whether from shock or rage, Daniel couldn't tell. "They're not even hiding it anymore. Shooting my men on my own property in broad daylight. This is war." "No," Catherine said firmly, helping Cole toward the horses. "This is attempted murder, which means we involve the federal marshal, not just Dalton. If soldiers are involved, this goes beyond local jurisdiction." "The nearest marshal is in Santa Fe," Thomas protested. "That's a 3-day ride each way. We don't have that kind of time." "Then I'll go tonight," Daniel said. "Travel fast. Explain the situation. Bring back federal authority that can't be ignored or intimidated. Catherine and Thomas can stay here, fortify the ranch, and wait for help to arrive." "Absolutely not," Catherine said immediately. "You're the primary target. Riding alone makes you vulnerable to ambush. If anyone goes, it should be someone they're not actively trying to kill." "She's right," Thomas agreed reluctantly. "Daniel, you're valuable here defending the ranch. We'll send Deacon. He knows the route to Santa Fe, and he's capable enough to make the journey safely." Daniel wanted to argue, but the logic was sound. Besides, leaving Catherine now felt wrong in ways he couldn't fully articulate. He'd promised partnership, which meant standing beside her through the danger, rather than riding off to fetch help while others did the fighting. "Fine," he said, "but we need to assume they'll attack again before Deacon returns. We fortify, set watches, and prepare for siege. If they want war, we make it costly enough that they reconsider." As the sun descended toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the Bennett ranch, Daniel felt the weight of his decisions settling around him like a physical presence. He'd stopped running, claimed a place to stand, and now that place was under assault by enemies who wouldn't be satisfied with anything less than his departure or death. Beside him, Catherine stood with the same determined expression he'd seen when she faced Wade's mob with a rifle. Thomas leaned on his cane, his face carved with worry, but his resolve evident. They were family now, or about to be, bound together by violence, and the fragile hope that standing together might be enough. The first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Somewhere out in the hills, men with guns and grievances were planning their next move. And Daniel Running Wolf, who'd spent a decade avoiding exactly this kind of entanglement, found himself checking his ammunition and preparing to defend a home he'd only just begun to believe might truly be his. Deacon rode out for Santa Fe 2 hours before dawn, carrying letters from Thomas detailing the attacks, the military boot prints, and Cole's shooting. The ranch held its breath as his silhouette disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness, knowing that help, if it came at all, was at least 6 days away. Daniel had not slept. He'd spent the night establishing defensive positions, reinforcing the barn's upper loft with sandbags and spare lumber to create a protected vantage point, moving ammunition and supplies to strategic locations, mapping sightlines and potential approaches. Catherine worked beside him without complaint, her movements efficient and purposeful. They spoke little, but the partnership Thomas had predicted was already forming, built on shared purpose rather than romantic sentiment. By the time full light arrived, the Bennett Ranch had transformed from a working cattle operation into something resembling a frontier fort. Cole, despite his wounded shoulder, insisted on taking a watch position in the main house. Martinez covered the bunkhouse, while Daniel and Catherine split duties between the barn and the perimeter patrols. Thomas supervised from the house, his tactical mind still sharp, even if his body could no longer execute the plans he devised. He'd seen range wars before, had survived Apache raids in the territory's wilder days, and understood that preparation often mattered more than courage when violence finally arrived. The attack came on the third morning, just after sunrise, when exhaustion was heaviest and attention most likely to waver. Daniel spotted them first, a line of riders approaching from the east, perhaps 20 strong, moving with the coordinated precision of men who'd planned this assault carefully. They weren't trying to hide their approach, which meant they either had overwhelming confidence in their numbers or wanted to be seen as a show of force meant to intimidate rather than engage. "They're coming," Daniel called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "In 20 riders eastern approach, armed and organized." Catherine emerged from the house, rifle in hand, positioning herself beside the water trough that offered both cover and a clear field of fire. Martinez appeared at the bunkhouse window, his Winchester already sighted on the approaching line. Thomas stood on the porch despite Daniel's earlier protests, his revolver holstered but accessible. The riders stopped just beyond rifle range, forming a loose semicircle. But Garrison was there, predictably, his face still showing bruises from their earlier encounter. But he wasn't leading. That honor belonged to a man Daniel didn't recognize, someone older and harder, sitting his horse with the rigid posture of military training that never quite faded, even after the uniform came off. "That's Captain Marcus Hendricks," Thomas said quietly, having moved beside Daniel despite his limp. "Retired from the cavalry 5 years ago after some incident at Fort Selden that was quietly buried. He's been working as a hired gun ever since, running a gang of former soldiers who'll do anything for the right price." "Who's paying him?" Daniel asked. "That's the question, isn't it?" Thomas's expression was grim. "Wade couldn't afford Hendricks' services. Someone with deeper pockets wants us gone, and they're using Wade's grievance as cover for something larger." Hendricks urged his horse forward, stopping at what he clearly calculated was the maximum effective range for the rifles pointed in his direction. He was perhaps 50, his face weathered by sun and violence, his eyes holding the flat affect of someone who'd killed enough that it no longer registered as significant. "Thomas Bennett," Hendricks called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "I'm here representing the concerned citizens of Mesa Ridge. They've authorized me to present you with final terms for resolving this unfortunate situation." "I don't negotiate with hired guns," Thomas replied, "and I certainly don't recognize the authority of so-called concerned citizens who hide behind intimidation and violence. Nevertheless, I'll state the terms. You have until sunset to send the Apache half-breed on his way. If he's gone, this ends peacefully. The citizens will forget about your daughter's poor judgment, and life returns to normal." If he remains, we'll be forced to take measures that serve justice, even if the law is too weak to act. Justice? Catherine's voice was sharp with contempt. Is that what you call shooting an unarmed ranch hand from ambush? Or threatening to burn down our home while we slept? Hendricks turned his cold gaze toward her. I call it consequences, Miss Bennet. Your father's expansion has squeezed out smaller operations. His fences have blocked traditional grazing routes. And now he's harboring a savage who attacked upstanding citizens. The people of this valley have been patient, but patience has limits. The only savage I see, Daniel said, stepping into the open where Hendricks could see him clearly, is a man who hires out his gun to cowards too afraid to face their grievances honestly. You want me gone, Captain? Come and try to remove me yourself, without your hired army at your back. Hendricks smiled, though the expression held no warmth. Brave words from a half-breed who should have stayed in whatever rocks his people hide in. But I'm not here to fight, Running Wolf. I'm here to deliver terms and ensure compliance. What happens next depends entirely on Bennett's choice. My choice was made when I announced my daughter's engagement, Thomas said. Daniel Running Wolf is family. Anyone who threatens him threatens me, and I respond to threats the same way I always have, by standing my ground and defending what's mine. Then you're a fool. Hendricks' voice hardened. You're outnumbered, outgunned, and isolated. The sheriff won't help you. He knows which way the wind blows. By nightfall, you'll either surrender Running Wolf, or we'll take him by force and burn everything that stands in our way. You're forgetting something. Captain, Catherine said, her rifle now visibly trained on Hendricks' chest. We sent for the federal marshal 3 days ago. He's probably already on his way. When he arrives and finds you've attacked a civilian ranch, murdered citizens, and violated territorial law, you'll hang. All of you. Something flickered in Hendricks' expression. Not quite fear, but calculation. A marshal's days away at best. A lot can happen in days, Miss Bennet. Accidents occur, buildings burn, people die in ways that can't be easily proven. By the time federal authority arrives, this will be settled, and the story will be whatever the survivors say it is. Is that your professional opinion? Daniel asked, or your employer's instructions? Who's really paying you, Hendricks? Because Wade Garrison couldn't afford your services for a day, much less organize this level of operation. The captain's face remained impassive. But Daniel saw the slight tension in his shoulders that suggested the question had struck close to something he'd been ordered to keep hidden. My employer's identity is none of your concern, but I'll tell you this, Running Wolf. There are powerful interests who want this ranch, and they're willing to remove any obstacles in their path. You're just the most convenient obstacle at the moment. The railroad, Thomas said suddenly, pieces apparently falling into place. They've been surveying routes through the valley. My property sits directly in the path of their preferred route, and I've refused every offer they've made to purchase. This isn't about Wade's grievances or prejudice against Daniel. This is about clearing title to land the railroad wants. Hendricks didn't confirm or deny, but his silence was answer enough. Wade Garrison, visible behind the captain, looked confused, as though realizing for the first time that his vengeance had been co-opted for purposes beyond his understanding. So what's the plan, Captain? Daniel continued, pressing the advantage of Hendricks' revealed motivation. Kill us all, make it look like a range war or Indian uprising. Then the railroad sweeps in to purchase the property from whoever inherits. That's ambitious, even for a man with your reputation. The plan, Hendricks said coldly, is to give you until sunset to make the smart choice. After that, what happens is on your conscience, Bennet. He turned his horse, preparing to withdraw. Oh, and one more thing. We're not the only ones watching. If that marshal you sent for actually makes it through the passes alive, he'll find a situation already resolved, with testimony from 20 witnesses that all confirms the same story. Think about that before you decide that stubbornness is worth your daughter's life. The threat against Deacon was clear. Hendricks had men watching the road to Santa Fe, ready to ensure the marshal never learned the truth. Even if help was coming, it might not arrive in time or arrive at all. The riders withdrew slowly, their confidence evident in the leisurely pace. They stopped about a mile distant, close enough to keep the ranch under observation, but far enough to be safe from rifle fire. They were settling in for a siege, content to wait until sunset before making their final move. Daniel watched them through the spyglass Thomas had provided, counting men and noting their positions. They're professional. Too professional for ranch hands or angry citizens. These are Hendrick's crew, former cavalry who know how to conduct an assault. Can we hold them off? Catherine asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Not indefinitely. We might survive the first attack, maybe the second if we're lucky, and they're careless. But eventually they'll overwhelm us through sheer numbers. Daniel lowered the spyglass. We need to change the equation somehow, find an advantage that numbers can't overcome. Thomas had been quiet, his expression thoughtful. Now he spoke with the careful precision of someone who'd been working through a problem and found an unpleasant solution. There's one option we haven't considered. We could give them what they want. Father, no, Catherine began, but Thomas held up his hand. Not Daniel. Me. I'm the one who owns this land, the one refusing to sell to the railroad. If I'm out of the picture, the property passes to Catherine, and they could pressure her into selling without the complications of my stubborn resistance. That's insane, Daniel said flatly. You think they'll just let you sacrifice yourself and leave the rest of us alone? Hendricks isn't operating on honor or fair play. Once violence starts, it won't stop until everyone who might testify is silenced. Daniel's right, Catherine added. And I'm not selling this ranch, Father. Not to the railroad, not to anyone. Mother loved this land. She's buried on that hill, overlooking the valley. I won't betray her memory by surrendering to hired thugs and corporate greed. A heavy silence settled over them, each person calculating odds and possibilities. Martinez had joined them from the bunkhouse, and even Cole had limped out from the main house, his wounded shoulder bound, but his expression determined. So we fight, Cole said simply. We're outnumbered, but we've got fortifications and righteousness on our side. That's got to count for something. Righteousness doesn't stop bullets, Martinez observed, though without apparent fear. But fighting does seem to be our only option that doesn't involve surrender or death. Daniel looked at the faces around him. Catherine's fierce determination, Thomas's grim acceptance, Martinez's quiet courage, and Cole's wounded defiance. These people had taken him in, offered him a home, and were now willing to die rather than betray the principles that defined them. The weight of that trust was heavier than any he'd carried before. There might be another way, Daniel said slowly, an idea forming that was equal parts desperate and dangerous. Hendricks is a soldier, which means he thinks like a soldier. He's expecting us to defend from fortified positions to make them come to us. What if we don't do what he expects? What are you suggesting? Thomas asked. I'm suggesting we take the fight to them. Not all of us. Catherine, Martinez, and Cole stay here to defend the ranch and create the illusion we're all present. But Thomas and I slip out after dark, circle around their position, and approach from behind while they're focused on the ranch. That's suicide, Catherine protested. 2 men against 20. 2 men with surprise against 20 who aren't expecting an attack from their rear. And I won't be trying to fight them all just to reach Hendricks. Cut off the head, and the body often loses its coordination. His men are mercenaries. They're loyal to payment, not cause. If Hendricks falls, they might decide the fight isn't worth continuing. Thomas was nodding slowly, seeing the logic even as his daughter saw only the risk. It could work. Hendricks is arrogant, confident in his numbers and position. He won't expect a counterattack, especially not from the 2 people he's targeting specifically. This is madness, Catherine said, her voice rising with emotion she'd kept carefully controlled until now. Father, your leg makes you a liability in combat. And Daniel, even if you reach Hendricks, his men will kill you immediately. This plan is just elaborate suicide. Daniel met her eyes, seeing the fear beneath her anger, the connection that had formed between them, making his potential death suddenly personal rather than tactical. It's a risk, yes, but staying here and waiting for them to attack when they're ready is guaranteed defeat. At least this way we seize initiative, create chaos, and maybe, just maybe, end this without everyone dying. I don't accept that these are our only options, Catherine insisted, though her voice had lost its certainty. Neither do I, Thomas said gently, placing a weathered hand on his daughter's shoulder. But sometimes we have to choose between terrible options and worse ones. If Daniel and I can end this tonight, you inherit a ranch that's protected, a future that's secure, and a husband who proved his commitment with more than words. The last phrase hung in the air, a husband. They'd been so focused on survival that the engagement announcement had faded into background noise, but Thomas's words brought it back into sharp focus. If Daniel died tonight, Catherine would lose not just an ally, but the possibility of whatever future they might build together. She turned away abruptly, walking toward the house with rigid control that suggested she was holding herself together through sheer will. Daniel wanted to follow, to offer comfort or reassurance, but Martinez's hand on his arm stopped him. "Give her a moment," the ranch hand said quietly. "She's not used to feeling helpless, and what you're proposing takes away her ability to fight beside you. That's harder for her than the actual danger." The sun crawled across the sky with agonizing slowness. They spent the afternoon in final preparations, checking weapons, gathering supplies for the night mission, arranging signals so those defending the ranch would know when to expect Daniel and Thomas's attack from behind the enemy lines. Catherine returned eventually, her face composed, but her eyes red-rimmed. She said nothing about her earlier outburst, instead focusing on practical details with fierce concentration. She helped Daniel check his ammunition, packed supplies for their midnight journey, and provided detailed descriptions of the terrain behind Hendrik's position, based on her years of riding this land. As sunset approached, painting the sky in those same copper and crimson shades that had greeted Daniel's first arrival at Mesa Ridge, Hendrik sent another rider forward. This one carried a torch, its flame visible in the fading light. "Bennett," the rider called. "Captain Hendricks extends his final courtesy. Send out Running Wolf in the next hour, and this ends bloodlessly. You have my captain's word that no harm will come to your property or family. Refuse, and at full dark we come in force. You have children and women to consider. Don't let pride make you responsible for their deaths." "We have no children here," Thomas called back. "And the woman you refer to can outshoot half your captain's mercenaries. Tell Hendricks he can take his courtesy and his threats and return to whatever railroad executive is paying him. The Bennett Ranch doesn't surrender to hired thugs." The rider departed without further argument, and the last light faded from the sky. Stars emerged, scattered across the darkness like chips of ice. A coyote called in the distance, its cry lonely and somehow appropriate to the moment. Daniel and Thomas prepared to leave through the back of the house, moving through the kitchen, where Catherine was ostensibly preparing a meal, but actually stealing glances at them with barely concealed worry. At the door, Daniel paused. Catherine stood with her back to him, gripping the edge of the kitchen table with white-knuckled intensity. Without thinking about propriety or permission, he crossed the room and turned her to face him. "I'm coming back," he said simply. "You can't promise that." "No. But I can promise I'll fight like hell to make it true, because I've finally found something worth fighting for." He cupped her face in his hands, seeing his own reflection in her eyes. "Or whatever happens tonight, know that these past 2 weeks have meant more to me than the previous 10 years combined." Catherine's composure finally cracked. She pulled him close, her embrace fierce and desperate. "Don't you dare die. Daniel Running Wolf, don't you dare make me inherit this ranch alone after I've finally found someone who sees me as a partner instead of property." They held each other for a long moment. This embrace that was both first and possibly last, carrying all the words they hadn't said and the future they might never have. Then Thomas cleared his throat gently, reminding them that time was running short and enemies were waiting. Daniel released Catherine reluctantly, stepping back but holding her gaze. "Keep the barn secure. If anything goes wrong with our attack, that's your strong point." Martinez knows the plan. Trust his judgment. I trust yours more, she said. So make sure you're here to exercise. They slipped out into the darkness, Daniel and Thomas moving with the careful silence of hunters who understood that prey with guns could easily become predators. Behind them, the ranch lights burned defiantly, a beacon of civilization in the territorial darkness. Ahead, Hendrix's camp waited, confident in their numbers and unaware that the prey they'd been hunting was about to bare its teeth. The night swallowed them whole, and the only sound was the whisper of wind through sage and the distant murmur of men preparing for violence they believed would be one-sided. By dawn, everything would be different. Either the Bennett Ranch would stand vindicated, or it would burn as a warning to others who dared resist the machinery of progress that ground obstacles into dust without mercy or hesitation. The terrain behind Hendrix's camp was treacherous in darkness, rocky outcroppings that could turn an ankle, patches of loose shale that clattered underfoot if you weren't careful, and scattered juniper that provided cover but also concealed the uneven ground beneath. Daniel moved through it with the practiced silence his mother's people had taught him, while Thomas followed as best his damaged leg would allow, using his cane to test each step before committing his weight. They'd been traveling for nearly 2 hours, circling wide to approach the mercenary camp from the northwest, when Thomas stumbled. The sound wasn't loud, just the scrape of boot on stone and a sharp intake of breath, but in the desert night it carried like a shout. Daniel froze immediately, listening for any indication they'd been heard. Voices drifted from the camp ahead, casual conversation punctuated by occasional laughter. Someone was telling a story about a saloon girl in Tucson. Another voice complained about the quality of their coffee. Normal sounds of men waiting for orders, bored and confident in their superior position. Daniel helped Thomas to a sheltered spot between 2 boulders where the older man could rest his leg. In the faint starlight, he could see the pain etched across Thomas's face, though the rancher made no complaint. "I'm slowing you down," Thomas whispered. "You should go ahead. I'll create a distraction from here when you signal." "We stick together," Daniel replied. "That was the plan. Plans change when circumstances demand it. You know I'm right. My leg is a liability in close combat. But I can still shoot, and a gunshot from an unexpected direction will draw their attention while you move on Hendrix." Daniel wanted to argue, but tactical reality overrode sentiment. Thomas was correct. His mobility was too compromised for the kind of silent approach Daniel needed to make. But leaving him alone, vulnerable, felt like betrayal of the partnership they'd been building. "Give me 30 minutes to get into position," Daniel said finally. "Then fire 3 shots at their perimeter guards. That should pull enough men toward your location that I can reach Hendrix with reduced interference." Thomas nodded, checking his revolver with hands that were steady despite the pain. "Daniel, if this goes wrong, if I don't make it back, promise me you'll protect Catherine. Not just from Hendrix, but from the railroad, from men who'll see her as vulnerable once I'm gone. She's strong, but this territory breaks strong people who stand alone. You'll be there to protect her yourself," Daniel insisted. "Promise me anyway." The words carried the weight of a dying man's request, though Thomas was very much alive. Daniel recognized it for what it was. A father's final insurance policy, transferring responsibility he'd carried alone for too long. "I promise, but you're going to be around to make sure I keep it properly." Thomas smiled, the expression visible even in darkness. "Then you'd better move. Time's wasting, and Catherine will have both our hides if we let Hendrix burn her ranch while we sit in the rocks having sentimental conversations." Daniel squeezed the older man's shoulder once, then melted back into the darkness. He moved faster now, alone and unencumbered, using every skill he'd learned in a lifetime of existing between worlds. The Apache side of his heritage had taught him to read terrain by feel, to move without sound, to become part of the landscape rather than an intruder upon it. The white side had taught him strategy, the ability to think like his enemies and anticipate their movements. Hendrix's camp came into view, a rough circle of bedrolls around a central fire. Guards posted at cardinal points, horses picketed on the eastern edge where they could be quickly accessed. The captain himself sat apart from his men, studying what appeared to be a map by lamplight, planning tomorrow's assault with the methodical precision of someone who'd conducted too many similar operations to leave anything to chance. Daniel counted 18 men total, which meant 2 were missing, either already deployed as advance scouts or perhaps assigned to watch for the federal marshal Deacon had been sent to summon. The odds were still impossible, but slightly less impossible than they'd been. He circled to the north side of the camp, where shadows were deepest and the terrain offered the most cover. A dry wash provided a natural approach route, and he followed it carefully, testing each handhold before trusting his weight to it. The wash brought him within 50 feet of where Hendricks sat, close enough to hear the captain's voice as he spoke to someone Daniel couldn't see. Railroad's getting impatient. They wanted this resolved weeks ago. If Bennett doesn't surrender by morning, we burn everything. Make it look like the half-breed went crazy, attacked the ranch, and we intervened too late to save the family. The railroad buys the property from the territorial court at a discount, and we collect our final payment. What about witnesses? The second voice belonged to Wade Garrison, recognizable even in a whisper. Cole and Martinez know what really happened. The daughter, too. Accidents happen in fires, Hendricks said coldly. Smoke inhalation, structural collapse. By the time investigators arrive, if they bother, the story will be whatever we tell them. The local sheriff already knows to support our version, and with Running Wolf dead and burned, there's no one left to contradict the narrative. Daniel's blood ran cold. They weren't planning intimidation or property destruction. This was premeditated murder, designed to look like something else entirely. Catherine, Martinez, Cole, all of them marked for death to satisfy railroad ambitions and cover up Hendricks' crimes. He was calculating his approach, preparing to move, when Thomas's signal cracked through the night. 3 gunshots in rapid succession from the northwest, exactly as planned. The camp erupted into controlled chaos. Hendricks barked orders, sending 6 men toward the sound, while the rest formed a defensive perimeter around the camp. Daniel moved during the confusion, covering the remaining distance in seconds. He emerged from the wash directly behind Hendricks's position, his knife drawn, his other hand reaching for the captain before anyone could react. But Hendricks was faster than expected, veteran instinct making him pivot at the last instant. Daniel's knife scraped across the captain's ribs instead of finding his throat, drawing blood, but not the disabling wound he'd intended. Hendricks shouted warning to his men while simultaneously drawing his sidearm. Daniel tackled him before the gun cleared leather, and they went down in a tangle of limbs. The pistol discharged into the dirt, and suddenly the remaining mercenaries were converging on their position, weapons drawn. Shouting questions and threats, Daniel drove his knee into Hendricks' gut, buying enough time to regain his feet. He stood in the center of the camp, surrounded by men with guns pointed at his chest, knowing he had seconds before they simply shot him down like a rabid dog. "Hold your fire!" Hendricks wheezed, struggling upright, one hand pressed to his bleeding side. "I want him alive. The railroad will pay extra if we can stage this properly. Make it look like he confessed before dying." The mercenaries hesitated, which gave Daniel the opening he needed. "Your employer's plan is murder," he called out, loud enough for all of them to hear. "Hendricks just told Wade that you're supposed to burn the Bennett ranch with everyone inside. Make it look like I did it. You're not hired security. You're accomplices to mass murder. When the federal marshal arrives, you'll all hang." Several of the men exchanged uncertain glances. These were hardened veterans, but there was a difference between range war violence and the cold-blooded murder of women in their own home. Hendricks recognized the wavering immediately. "Don't listen to him," the captain snapped. "He's trying to divide us, turn you against legitimate authority. We're enforcing the will of concerned citizens against an Indian who attacked civilized men. I'm enforcing the will of a railroad that wants property it can't legally acquire," Daniel countered. "Hendricks works for the Territorial Railway Company. They've offered to buy the Bennett Ranch 3 times, been refused 3 times, and now they're paying your captain to clear the title through murder. Ask yourselves, is that the kind of work you signed on for? Killing unarmed ranchers and burning women alive? He's lying, Hendricks insisted, but his voice had lost its certainty. Wade, tell them. Tell them about the grievances, about why we're here. Wade Garrison looked between Daniel and Hendricks, confusion and dawning realization crossing his face. You told me this was about justice, about making Bennett pay for testifying against me, for harboring the Indian. You never said anything about railroads or burning folks alive, because you're too stupid to understand complex negotiations, Hendricks sneered, his contempt finally breaking through his controlled facade. You were a useful cover, Wade, the angry rancher with legitimate grievances, but you were never more than a convenient excuse for what needed to happen anyway. The admission hung in the night air, damning and absolute. Wade's face darkened with humiliation and rage. You used me, made me think I was fighting for my rights, when really I was just your puppet to justify murder. You were everyone's puppet, Hendricks said dismissively. The railroad's mine, your own stupidity and resentment. Now shut up and let me handle this before. The gunshot came from the darkness beyond the camp's perimeter, not Thomas's position, but somewhere else entirely. It struck Hendricks in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his pistol flying. Before anyone could react, more shots followed, carefully placed to kick up dirt near the mercenary's feet rather than kill, but demonstrating lethal accuracy that couldn't be ignored. Federal Marshal. A new voice called from the darkness. Drop your weapons and step away from the prisoner. You're all under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, arson, and violation of territorial law. Daniel recognized the voice. Deacon, the ranch hand Thomas had sent to Santa Fe. But he hadn't been gone long enough to reach the marshal and return. Which meant either he'd found the lawman much closer than expected, or this was an elaborate bluff, designed to create exactly the chaos now unfolding. The mercenaries were looking at each other, at Hendricks bleeding on the ground, at the darkness where the shots had originated. Their loyalty to payment wavered against the possibility of federal prosecution and hanging. One by one they began lowering their weapons. You're fools, Hendricks gasped, clutching his wounded shoulder. That's not the marshal. It's a trick, and you're falling for it like children afraid of shadows. Maybe, one of the older mercenaries said, but maybe not. And I didn't sign on to hang for murdering women. Captain, I think our contract just ended. He dropped his rifle and raised his hands. Others followed, until only 3 men remained armed. The true believers, or the ones too committed to back out now. Wade Garrison stood apart, his weapon holstered, his expression suggesting his world had collapsed, and he was still processing the rubble. Daniel used the distraction to move on Hendricks, kicking the captain's fallen pistol away and pinning him with a knee to his wounded shoulder. Hendricks cried out in pain, but Daniel didn't relent. Your employer's name, Daniel demanded. Who at the railroad ordered this? Go to hell, Hendricks spat. Daniel pressed harder. I can make this last or I can make it quick. Your choice, but you're going to answer, Daniel. Catherine's voice cut through the darkness, and suddenly she was there, emerging from the same wash he'd used, rifle in hand, and Deacon right behind her. Not the marshal, they'd come themselves, unable to wait, while the men they cared about faced danger alone. Behind them, amazingly, was Sheriff Dalton, looking deeply uncomfortable but present nonetheless. And with the sheriff was another man, older, distinguished, wearing city clothes that marked him as someone from outside the territory. I'm Arthur Blackwell, the stranger announced, his voice carrying authority that made even the armed mercenaries straighten unconsciously. Chief Territorial Investigator for the Justice Department. I've been tracking Captain Hendricks' activities for 6 months, gathering evidence of his involvement in land fraud schemes across New Mexico. Sheriff Dalton brought me here tonight after Miss Bennett convinced him that federal crimes were being committed. Hendricks's face went pale. This wasn't a bluff or a trick. This was the worst possible outcome. Federal authority with jurisdiction that superseded local corruption and the power to prosecute crimes that territorial courts might Ignore the railroad representative you're working for is named Edmund Carstairs, Blackwell continued, consulting a notebook by lamplight. He's already under investigation for similar activities in Arizona territory. Your testimony against him, Captain, might be enough to reduce your sentence from hanging to life imprisonment. Refuse to cooperate, and I guarantee you'll dance at the end of a rope within 6 months. The calculation was visible on Hendrick's face. Loyalty to an employer who'd likely abandon him versus the slim chance of survival through betrayal. Self-preservation won, as Blackwell had undoubtedly known it would. I'll testify, Hendrick said hoarsely. I'll tell you everything about Carstairs, about the land schemes, about the payoffs to local officials. But I want it in writing. Immunity from hanging in exchange for full cooperation. That's for a judge to decide, Blackwell said. But I'll recommend leniency in exchange for truthful testimony. Gentlemen, he addressed the surrendered mercenaries, you're all under arrest, but cooperation will be noted favorably when charges are filed. Daniel stood slowly, releasing Hendricks to Deacon's custody. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the night's action was fading, leaving exhaustion and the shakes that came after violence when you finally had time to realize how close death had actually been. Catherine reached him first, her hands checking him for injuries with urgent efficiency. You're bleeding, Hendrick's blood, not mine. He caught her hands, stilling their frantic movement. I'm fine, whole, alive. She looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw everything she hadn't said, the fear she'd carried through the darkness, the courage it had taken to defy his plan and come anyway, the relief that was crumbling her carefully maintained composure. Don't ever do that again, she whispered. Don't ever make me wait while you face death alone. I won't, I promise. Partners means facing everything together, right? Everything, she agreed. And then she was kissing him, fierce and desperate and full of all the emotion she'd kept contained through days of crisis. The mercenaries looked away politely. Deacon smiled. Even Blackwell seemed faintly amused by the impropriety of it. Daniel returned the kiss with equal intensity, this first real intimacy between them that was choice rather than strategy, desire rather than obligation. When they finally separated, both breathing hard, the night seemed different somehow, less threatening, more full of possibility. A shot rang out, sudden and jarring. Everyone spun toward the sound, weapons rising, but the threat wasn't external. Wade Garrison stood with a smoking pistol in his hand, and Hendricks lay motionless on the ground, a new wound in his chest pumping blood into the dirt. He used me, Wade said dully, staring at the gun as though unsure how it had gotten into his hand. Made me into a murderer for railroad money and lies. That can't stand. Won't stand. Sheriff Dalton moved toward Wade carefully. Put down the gun, Wade. It's over. Let justice handle Hendricks. Justice? Wade laughed, the sound brittle and broken. Like the justice that ignored my complaints about Bennett? Like the justice that let this bastard turn me into his weapon? No, Sheriff. I'm done being used. By him, by the railroad, by my own stupidity. He turned the gun toward his own head. Daniel moved without thinking, covering the distance in 3 strides, striking Wade's arm just as the weapon discharged. The bullet went wild, and Wade collapsed, not from injury, but from something breaking inside him that couldn't be fixed with bandages or time. He made me a fool, Wade sobbed, all his rage and pride collapsing into grief. Made me think I was fighting for something real when I was just dancing to his tune. I've lost everything, my reputation, my self-respect, any chance of making something of myself. What's left? Daniel crouched beside him. This man who'd been his enemy, who'd brought violence and threat to the only home he'd found in 10 years of searching. What's left is choice. You can let this define you, or you can rebuild from it. Neither is easy, but one leads somewhere and the other just leads to more darkness. Wade looked up at him, confusion mixing with his despair. Why would you help me? After everything I've done? Because someone once gave me a second chance when I didn't deserve it, Daniel said, thinking of Thomas Bennett's offer, of Catherine's partnership, of the grace he'd been shown despite his own past mistakes. And because staying angry takes more energy than I have left, Blackwell's men had secured Hendricks, who was alive but unconscious from blood loss. The mercenaries were being bound and prepared for transport. Dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern horizon, bringing with it the promise that this long night was finally ending. Thomas emerged from the rocks where he'd been positioned, limping but triumphant, Martinez and Cole flanking him with rifles still ready for threats that no longer existed. The Bennett ranch hands had followed Catherine and Deacon, unable to let their employer face danger without support. "Is it over?" Thomas asked, looking between the captured mercenaries, the wounded Hendricks, and the federal investigator who represented authority beyond local corruption. "It's over," Blackwell confirmed. "The Bennett ranch is safe. The railroad scheme is exposed, and you'll all need to provide testimony, but you're witnesses now, not victims. The law protects witnesses." As the sun crested the horizon, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber, the group began the walk back to the Bennett ranch. Daniel and Catherine walked together, shoulders touching, neither speaking, but both acutely aware of what they'd survived and what awaited them. Behind them, Wade Garrison walked in custody, his head down, his spirit broken. Ahead, the ranch buildings came into view, still standing, still home. And somewhere in the distance, a coyote called its morning song, welcoming the day and all the choices it would bring. The Bennett ranch had never seen so many people gathered in one place. News of the confrontation with Hendricks and the railroad's conspiracy had spread through Mesa Ridge like wildfire. And now, 3 weeks later, the entire valley seemed to have assembled for what folks were calling the wedding of the decade. Daniel stood on the porch of the main house, adjusting the collar of the new shirt Catherine had insisted he wear. It was fine cotton, white as fresh snow, a far cry from the trail-worn clothes he'd arrived in. His hands felt awkward with the mother-of-pearl buttons, fingers more accustomed to rope and reins than formal attire. "You look like you're about to face a firing squad," Martinez observed, leaning against the porch rail with an amused grin. The ranch hand had recovered fully from the tense nights of siege, and his loyalty to the family had been rewarded with a promotion to foreman once the crew returned from Colorado. "Feels similar," Daniel admitted. "At least with a firing squad, you know what's expected of you. Stand still. Say the right words at the right time. Don't faint when Catherine appears." Martinez ticked off the requirements on his fingers. "How hard can it be?" Thomas emerged from the house dressed in his finest suit, his silver hair combed back, his limp somehow less pronounced today, as though even his damaged leg recognized the importance of the occasion. He carried 2 glasses of whiskey, offering one to Daniel. "Liquid courage," Thomas said. "Though I suspect you faced worse than a wedding ceremony." Daniel accepted the glass, grateful for something to do with his hands. "The waiting is harder than the doing. Give me a clear objective and an enemy to face. I know what to do." He gestured toward the assembled crowd. The decorations Catherine and the women from town had spent days arranging. The minister from Mesa Ridge, who'd agreed to perform the ceremony despite his initial reservations. "This is unfamiliar territory. Marriage generally is," Thomas said with a slight smile, "even for people who've known each other for years instead of weeks. But Daniel, I want you to know, watching how you and Catherine have worked together since that night with Hendricks, seeing the partnership you've built, I have no doubts about this decision. You're good for her and she for you. That's rarer than you might think." The past 3 weeks had indeed transformed their arrangement from practical necessity to something approaching genuine partnership. They'd spent hours working side by side, rebuilding damaged fences, managing the returning cattle crew, providing testimony to Blackwell's investigation. They'd argued over ranch decisions. Catherine favored expanding the breeding program, while Daniel thought diversifying into horses made more sense. But they'd learned to compromise, to value each other's expertise, to find solutions that incorporated both perspectives. And in the evenings, after the work was done and the ranch had settled into night's quiet, they talked about childhoods and dreams, about fears and hopes, about the future they might build if they were brave enough to try. The physical intimacy would come in time. They'd agreed to let that develop naturally, rather than forcing it based on a ceremony date. But the emotional intimacy was already growing, roots sinking deep into soil that had seemed barren just weeks before. "I hope I'm worthy of her trust," Daniel said quietly. "You already are. The question is whether you believe it yourself." Thomas finished his whiskey. "Time to take your place. The ceremony starts in 10 minutes, and Catherine has promised to be prompt, which means she's probably been ready for an hour and is currently wearing a path in her bedroom floor with pacing." The ceremony area was beneath a massive cottonwood tree that marked the high point of the Bennett property. From here, you could see the entire valley spread below, the ranch buildings, the pastures with their grazing cattle, the creek that provided water through the seasons, and in the distance, the town of Mesa Ridge, where opinions about today's wedding ranged from scandalized to cautiously supportive. Chairs had been arranged in neat rows, most of them borrowed from neighboring ranches whose owners had decided that curiosity outweighed prejudice. Daniel recognized faces from town, the general store proprietor who'd refused him service now sitting uncomfortably in the third row. Several ranch families he'd met during his weeks, helping with various valley projects, and even Sheriff Dalton, who'd become considerably more cooperative since Blackwell's investigation had revealed the depth of corruption the railroad had fostered. Cole sat in the front row, his wounded shoulder still bound but healing well. Beside him was Deacon, who'd been instrumental in bringing Blackwell to the ranch that crucial night. The crew that had returned from Colorado occupied 2 full rows, their initial wariness about Daniel giving way to respect as they'd worked together and seen his competence firsthand. But there were also unexpected guests. A group of Apaches sat apart on the eastern edge, men and women Daniel recognized from the reservation, including his mother's cousin Gray Fox, who'd sent word that family should witness family, regardless of what white law or custom dictated. Their presence was a statement. This marriage might happen in white society's terms, but it also acknowledged Daniel's heritage in ways that transcended ceremony. Minister Hackett stood beneath the cottonwood, his Bible open, his expression suggesting he was still reconciling his religious duty with his personal discomfort about this union. But Thomas's generous donation to the church building fund had apparently helped ease his conscience. Music began. Not the organ that would have accompanied a church wedding, but a fiddle player from the valley whose skills were legendary. The tune was traditional, something about love enduring through hardship, and it silenced the murmuring crowd as everyone turned toward the main house. Catherine appeared on the porch, and Daniel's breath caught. She wore a dress of deep cream silk, simple in design, but elegant, with lace at the collar and cuffs that had belonged to her mother. Her dark blonde hair was arranged in a style that was simultaneously formal and practical, adorned with wildflowers from the mesa, Indian paintbrush and purple aster and golden columbine. She carried no bouquet, instead walking with her hands free, her stride confident despite the unfamiliar dress. But it was her expression that arrested Daniel's attention. She wasn't performing demure femininity for the crowd's benefit. Instead, she walked toward him with her chin up, her eyes locked on his, a slight smile playing at her lips that suggested she was as amused by this spectacle as he was nervous about it. Thomas met her at the porch steps, offering his arm in the traditional gesture, but Catherine shook her head slightly and instead walked beside her father as an equal rather than property being transferred. The crowd murmured at this breach of custom, but Thomas seemed unsurprised, even pleased by his daughter's assertion of independence, even in this most traditional of ceremonies. When they reached the cottonwood, Thomas didn't place Catherine's hand in Daniel's with the usual patriarchal pronouncement. Instead, he stepped back, and Catherine moved to stand beside Daniel of her own volition, her choice visible and deliberate. "We gather today," Minister Hackett began, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd, to witness the union of Catherine Marie Bennett and Daniel Runningwolf in the bonds of holy matrimony. This is not a union undertaken lightly, but with full knowledge of the challenges such a marriage will face in our society. Daniel felt Catherine's hand find his, her grip firm and steady. They discussed this moment, agreed that the ceremony would acknowledge rather than ignore the complications of their different heritages, the social barriers they'd be navigating together. Marriage, the minister continued, is fundamentally about two people choosing each other despite and because of their differences, building something together that neither could build alone. It requires honesty, compromise, and the courage to face an uncertain future with faith in each other rather than certainty about outcomes. The words were more thoughtful than Daniel had expected, less about religious duty and more about practical partnership. He suspected Catherine had negotiated the specific language, ensuring the ceremony reflected their understanding of what they were undertaking. Daniel Runningwolf, do you take Catherine Bennett to be your lawfully wedded wife? To stand beside her through prosperity and hardship? To honor her choices while offering your own perspective? To build a life together based on mutual respect and shared purpose? I do, Daniel said, his voice steady despite his earlier nerves. This wasn't just a ceremony, it was public commitment, witnessed and binding, but also true to what he actually felt. Catherine Bennett, do you take Daniel Runningwolf to be your lawfully wedded husband? To stand beside him through prosperity and hardship? To honor his heritage while sharing your own? To build a life together based on mutual respect and shared purpose? I do, Catherine replied, her voice carrying clearly, no hesitation or doubt evident. The couple has prepared their own vows, Minister Hackett said. Stepping back slightly to give them space, Catherine turned to face Daniel fully, still holding his hands. I promise to see you as you are, not as the world tries to define you. To value your skills and knowledge, to listen when you speak, to disagree when necessary, but always with respect. I promise to stand with you against whatever challenges come, to be your partner rather than your burden, and to build something together that honors both the family I came from and the family we're creating. Daniel had spent days composing his own vows, writing and rewriting, but now, standing before her with the sun warm on his shoulders and her hands in his, the prepared words felt insufficient. He spoke instead from something deeper, less practiced but more true. I promise to protect what we're building, not with walls but with presence, not by standing in front of you but beside you. I promise to bring all of myself to this partnership, my skills and my failures, my heritage and my uncertainties. I promise to stay, Catherine, to stop running and start rooting, to let this place and this partnership matter enough that I'll fight for it when challenged and nurture it when peaceful. You've given me something I'd stopped believing existed, a home. I promise to honor that gift by being worthy of it. The crowd was silent, moved despite themselves by the rawness of his declaration. Even those who'd come skeptical or disapproving seemed affected by the obvious sincerity. Minister Hackett cleared his throat, consulting his Bible. By the authority vested in me by the territory of New Mexico and the grace of God, I pronounce you husband and wife. Daniel, you may kiss your bride. Daniel cupped Catherine's face gently, giving her time to pull back if she chose. Instead, she rose on her toes to meet him, and their kiss was neither chaste ceremony nor passionate spectacle, but something in between, a promise made physical. A connection acknowledged publicly after weeks of growing privately. The crowd erupted in applause, some enthusiastic, some polite, but all acknowledging that something significant had transpired. Gray Fox and the Apache contingent stood as one, their traditional ululations carrying across the valley in recognition that transcended white custom. The reception that followed was elaborate by frontier standards. Tables had been set up beneath canvas awnings, laden with food contributed by families throughout the valley, roasted beef and venison, fresh bread and preserves, pies and cakes that represented the best efforts of a dozen ranch wives. Whiskey flowed freely, as did coffee for those who preferred sobriety. And the fiddle player was soon joined by a guitarist and harmonica player, creating music that transformed the gathering from formal ceremony to genuine celebration. Daniel found himself surrounded by well-wishers, some genuine, some going through social motions, all requiring acknowledgement. He shook more hands in 2 hours than he had in the previous 2 years, accepting congratulations and carefully navigating conversations with men who'd been his enemies just weeks before. Wade Garrison approached, surprisingly looking sober and considerably humbler than Daniel had ever seen him. The former antagonist had been released from custody after cooperating with Blackwell's investigation, his testimony against the railroad proving valuable enough to earn leniency. "I won't take much of your time," Wade said, his hat literally in his hands. "Just wanted to say I was wrong. About you, about the Bennetts, about everything I convinced myself was true, because it was easier than admitting my problems were my own doing. You'd have been justified letting me kill myself that night. Thank you for not." Daniel studied him, seeing genuine remorse rather than manipulation. "What will you do now?" "Heading to California. Got a cousin in Sacramento who runs a freight business. Says he can use help. Figure it's time to start over somewhere nobody knows my past." Wade managed a weak smile. "Maybe out there I can be someone better than who I was here." "Maybe we all can," Daniel said, offering his hand. Wade shook it, the grip brief but firm, then disappeared into the crowd. Another ghost from the past choosing different futures. The afternoon wore on, shadows lengthening across the valley as the sun descended toward the mountains. Gradually, guests began departing, families with children who needed to be home before dark, ranchers who had evening chores waiting, townspeople who'd satisfied their curiosity and could now return to Mesa Ridge with stories to tell. As the crowd thinned, Catherine found Daniel standing near the cottonwood, watching the sunset paint the valley in familiar copper and crimson shades. She slipped her hand into his, their wedding rings, simple silver bands Thomas had procured from a jeweler in Santa Fe, catching the fading light. "Having second thoughts?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "About a dozen," Daniel admitted. "But none that matter more than the certainty that this is where I'm supposed to be." "Good. Because I'd hate to be married to someone who didn't have healthy doubts about committing to a stubborn rancher's daughter with strong opinions about everything." He laughed, the sound surprising him with its genuine ease. "What happens now?" "Now we live," Catherine said simply. "We work the ranch, we build our partnership, we face whatever comes next as a team. The dramatic parts are over. This is where the real work begins. The real work being marriage. The real work being everything. Marriage, managing this land, navigating a society that doesn't quite know what to make of us. Figuring out who we are together rather than just who we are separately." She turned to face him fully, her expression serious but not worried. "It won't be easy, Daniel. People will talk, some will disapprove, and we'll have our own disagreements about how to run the ranch, how to live our lives. But I'd rather face difficult truth with you than easy comfort with someone else. That might be the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me," Daniel observed. "Then you've been talking to the wrong people." Catherine rose on her toes to kiss him again, this time without an audience, just the two of them, and the valley spread below and the first stars beginning to appear overhead. "Come on, Father's waiting to toast us privately before he retires. And then," she paused, color rising slightly in her cheeks, "then we begin our actual marriage, not just the ceremony of it." They walked back to the main house hand in hand, passing the few remaining guests who offered final congratulations. Thomas waited on the porch, 3 glasses and a bottle of his finest whiskey arranged on a small table. "To my daughter and my new son," Thomas said, pouring generous measures into each glass. "May your partnership be everything I hoped and more than I imagined. May you face your challenges together and celebrate your victories the same way. And may this land, which has been both blessing and burden to the Bennett family, become something new under your shared stewardship, not just a ranch, but a home where all are welcome who come with honest intentions. They drank the whiskey smooth and warming, and Thomas embraced them both before retreating inside, leaving them alone on the porch as full darkness finally claimed the valley. "I still can't quite believe this is real," Daniel said softly. 3 weeks ago, I was planning to ride through this territory without stopping. Now I'm married, part owner of a ranch, and apparently building a future I'd stopped imagining was possible. "Life has a way of ambushing us with possibilities," Catherine replied. "The question is whether we're brave enough to seize them when they appear." She took his hand, leading him toward the stairs that ascended to the second floor, to the room they'd share from this night forward. "Are you brave enough, Daniel Running Wolf, to stay and build and become someone new?" He followed her up the stairs, into the house that was now home, toward a future that was uncertain, but no longer lonely. Behind them the ranch settled into night, horses in the corrals, cattle in the pastures, the land itself breathing with the rhythms that had sustained it long before settlers arrived and would continue long after they were gone. "I'm brave enough to try," Daniel answered, and in that moment trying felt like enough. The door closed behind them, and the Bennett Ranch, now the Bennett Running Wolf Ranch, as the new sign Martinez was carving would proclaim, embraced the night. Tomorrow would bring work and challenges, questions to answer and problems to solve. But tonight there was only the promise made public and the partnership made private. Two people choosing each other against considerable odds, and finding in that choice something more valuable than certainty. Outside, Grey Fox and the remaining Apache prepared to depart, their presence having honored both Daniel's heritage and his new beginning. The old warrior caught Daniel's eye through the window, nodded once with something like approval, then turned his horse toward the reservation and the life he'd returned to, and in the distance, a coyote called its evening song, welcoming the darkness and all the transformations it concealed. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and possibility across the mesa, and the stars overhead bore witness to promises made and futures yet unwritten, the story that had begun with a stranger intervening in violence he could have ignored had become something else entirely, not an ending but a beginning. Not salvation delivered from outside, but partnership built from mutual choice and shared courage. The waters of crisis had receded, and what they'd revealed was solid ground where two people who'd spent their lives as outsiders could finally, improbably, belong. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.